Hello, my fellow story seekers. Welcome to Haunting Words. If you found this video, you're probably looking for something to help you drift off to sleep, and I'm here to deliver. But before we begin, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Now, get comfy, turn off the lights, and let your mind wander as I take you through tonight's story. I was never much of a hiker growing up. Sure, I'd done a few trails here and there with friends or family, but the idea of venturing deep into the woods on my own wasn't exactly my idea of fun. That changed last fall. It was late September, and the air had just started to cool. The leaves were turning shades of amber and crimson, making every scene look like it belonged on a postcard. I had just turned 32, and with work and life feeling increasingly suffocating, I decided I needed a break. I live in a small town nestled between two modest mountain ranges. The kind of place where everyone knows your name, and the nearest city is over an hour's drive away. The idea of solitude had become oddly comforting. I borrowed a detailed map from a friend and spent a few evenings charting a trail that led through a part of the forest I hadn't explored before. It was supposed to be a weekend trip, a quick escape to breathe, clear my head, and maybe test my limits a bit. Packing was straightforward. A sturdy tent, enough food and water for 2 days, a good flashlight, matches, a basic first aid kit, and a knife I'd never had to use beyond cutting rope. The mundane act of prepping my backpack felt like the most exciting thing I'd done in months. By Friday night, I was all set to leave early the next morning. When Saturday came, the sky was a brilliant blue. The sun filtered through my kitchen window as I finished my coffee and double-checked my gear. My neighbor, Mr. Arnold, a retired forest ranger, gave me a thumbs up as I loaded my pack into the car. "Stick to the trail markers," he said with a grin. "These woods can be tricky." The drive to the trailhead took about 40 minutes. The parking lot was almost empty when I arrived. Just a couple of other cars and an old van that looked like it hadn't moved in weeks. It was oddly reassuring. I'd hoped to avoid running into crowds. The trail started innocuously enough, wide and well-worn, with signs every half mile or so pointing out local landmarks or wildlife. For the first hour, I walked at a steady pace, occasionally pausing to snap a picture or two on my phone. The scenery was gorgeous, just as I'd hoped. Tall pines lined the path, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. The earthy scent of damp moss and fallen leaves was everywhere, and the sound of birdsong was a constant companion. By midday, I found a clearing where I could sit and eat the sandwich I packed for lunch. It was peaceful, quiet enough that I could hear the rustling of squirrels in the underbrush and the distant babble of a creek. I felt almost silly for ever doubting this trip. This was exactly what I needed. After lunch, I pressed on. The trail narrowed as it wound deeper into the forest. The sunlight grew patchy, filtering through the dense canopy above. I kept an eye on my map, occasionally checking the trail markers to make sure I was on the right path. By late afternoon, I'd covered more ground than I'd anticipated. I found a spot near the creek to set up camp. The sound of water trickling over rocks was soothing, and the area seemed undisturbed, almost untouched. Setting up the tent was quick. Afterward, I gathered some kindling for a small fire, using the last hours of daylight to relax and let the peace of the forest wash over me. As night fell, the woods came alive with a different kind of sound. Crickets chirped in a rhythmic cadence, and the occasional hoot of an owl echoed through the trees. I stayed up for a while, watching the flames flicker and feeling the warmth of the fire against the cool night air. By 10, I crawled into my tent and zipped up the door. My sleeping bag was surprisingly comfortable, and as I lay there listening to the symphony of the forest, I felt a sense of calm I hadn't experienced in years. I drifted off thinking this trip might just become a regular thing for me. And then something woke me, a sound faint but distinct. It wasn't the rustling of leaves or the distant call of an animal. It was a low, rhythmic creaking, like wood under pressure. For a moment, I thought it might be a branch swaying in the wind. But as I lay there in the dark, straining to listen, the noise continued, steady and deliberate. It was coming from deeper in the woods. The sound was faint but impossible to ignore. A low, rhythmic creak, like an old rocking chair swaying back and forth. I lay still in my sleeping bag, heart beating faster with each passing second. The fire outside had long since burned down to embers, and the only light now came from the faint glow of the moon filtering through the tent's thin fabric. At first, I told myself it was nothing. Maybe it was just a tree shifting in the wind or a branch about to break. I tried to rationalize it as I stared at the dark ceiling of the tent, ears straining for more clues. Creak. Pause. Creak. It didn't stop. I unzipped the sleeping bag just enough to sit up, careful not to make any noise. My flashlight was within arm's reach, but I hesitated to grab it. Something about the thought of breaking the darkness felt wrong, like it might draw attention to me. I sat there, listening. The sound wasn't getting closer, but it wasn't fading either. It seemed to be coming from the same direction, somewhere past the creek, deeper into the woods. Maybe it's just an animal, I whispered to myself, though I didn't believe it. Animals make rustling noises, sudden movements. This was too deliberate, too human. Minutes passed, or maybe it was seconds, I couldn't tell. Time felt stretched thin, like it could snap at any moment. The creaking sound finally stopped, replaced by an unsettling silence. Not the kind of peaceful quiet I'd enjoyed earlier in the day, but a heavy, oppressive stillness that seemed to suck the life out of the air. Even the crickets had gone quiet. I exhaled slowly, realizing I'd been holding my breath. Whatever it was, it seemed to be over. I lay back down, pulling the sleeping bag up to my chest, telling myself it was nothing, that I was just overreacting. It took a long time to fall asleep again. The next morning, the forest felt different. The sunlight filtering through the trees was just as warm, the air just as crisp, but something had shifted. I couldn't quite put my finger on it. I chalked it up to lingering unease from the night before and forced myself to focus on the tasks at hand, breaking camp, refilling my water bottle at the creek, and packing up my gear. As I crouched by the creek, filling my bottle, I noticed something odd. There were marks on the opposite bank, deep grooves in the muddy soil, like something heavy had been dragged through. The grooves led away from the water and disappeared into the dense underbrush. I stared at them for a long time, the bottle in my hand forgotten. They were too large to be from an animal and too irregular to be human footprints. My first thought was maybe it was debris from the creek, but the water wasn't strong enough to carry something that heavy. Shaking my head, I decided not to dwell on it. The woods were full of strange things, after all. I couldn't let myself get spooked by every little oddity. I shouldered my pack and continued along the trail. The next few hours were uneventful, almost relaxing. The trail wound through a series of rolling hills, the kind that made my legs ache, but offered stunning views of the forest below. I stopped once to eat an energy bar and check my map, making sure I was still on course. By early afternoon, I reached a small clearing with a crude wooden sign nailed to a tree. The sign was old, the wood weathered, and the paint nearly faded, but I could still make out the word crossing. It wasn't marked on my map, but I assumed it referred to an old path or animal trail. Something about the sign made me uneasy. It didn't look like it had been touched in years, yet the ground around the base of the tree was disturbed, as if someone or something had been there recently. I decided to push forward, ignoring the odd feeling in my gut. By the time I set up camp that evening, the strange sounds and the grooves in the mud felt like distant memories. I was tired, my muscles sore from the day's hike, and the promise of another peaceful night under the stars was enough to put me at ease. I built a fire, cooked a simple meal, and sat by the flames as the forest darkened around me. This campsite was less idyllic than the last, with gnarled trees pressing in close and the creek out of sight, but it felt safe enough. That was until I heard it again. The same creaking sound, faint but unmistakable, coming from somewhere in the distance. I froze, my fork halfway to my mouth. The sound was just like before, steady and rhythmic, but this time it was joined by something else, a low, almost imperceptible hum. My eyes darted toward the trees, but the firelight only reached so far, leaving most of the forest shrouded in darkness. "Hello?" I called out, my voice barely louder than a whisper. The sound stopped. I stood up slowly, the hair on the back of my neck standing on end. I grabbed the flashlight from my pack and turned it on, sweeping the beam across the trees. Nothing, just the same gnarled trunks and tangled branches I'd seen before. But then, just as I was about to turn off the flashlight, The beam caught something, a glint of light reflecting off metal, barely visible through the trees. It was gone as quickly as it appeared, but it was enough to send a chill down my spine. I sat by the fire for hours, my flashlight clutched tightly in one hand and my knife in the other. The creaking sound didn't return, but the hum lingered, a faint vibration in the air that seemed to seep into my bones. When I finally crawled into my tent, I left the flashlight on, its weak beam casting shadows on the fabric walls. I told myself it was nothing, just my mind playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew better. Something was out there, and it was watching. The next morning, the forest was cloaked in a heavy fog. It was so thick I could barely see 10 feet ahead of me. The usual vibrant chorus of birdsong and rustling leaves was muted, replaced by an eerie, oppressive stillness. I packed up camp in a hurry, determined to leave the unsettling noises and the strange hum behind me. As I hoisted my backpack, I glanced at the tree line, half expecting to see something or someone peering out from the mist. But there was nothing, just the shifting gray shapes of the fog. The trail felt different that day. The markers, which had been clear and easy to follow, seemed oddly spaced, as if someone had moved them. I paused at one junction where the path forked in two directions. Both routes looked equally worn, and neither matched the description on my map. I chose the left path, hoping it would lead me closer to the waypoint I'd marked the night before. It didn't. Hours passed, and the fog refused to lift. The trees seemed to grow closer together, their twisted branches forming a canopy that blocked out the sun. My GPS signal wavered and then vanished entirely, leaving me with only my compass and a growing sense of unease. By midday, I came across something I couldn't explain. A wooden totem stood in the middle of the trail. It was crudely carved, its surface etched with strange symbols that I couldn't decipher. The totem was weathered, its edges softened by time, but the ground around it was freshly disturbed. I knelt to get a closer look, brushing away the loose dirt with my fingers. The marks were deep and deliberate, as if someone or something had buried the base of the totem only recently. The air around the totem felt wrong. It was colder here, the chill biting through my jacket in a way that didn't match the rest of the forest. I didn't want to touch it, but I couldn't look away either. As I stood there, staring at the totem, a sound broke the silence. It wasn't the creaking or the hum from the night before. This was a sharp, snapping noise, like a branch breaking underfoot. I spun around, heart pounding, but saw nothing through the dense fog. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. No answer. I backed away from the totem, my hands shaking as I gripped my flashlight. The snapping noise came again, closer this time. I didn't wait to see what was making it. I turned and started walking quickly down the trail, my footsteps crunching against the gravel. The fog seemed to thicken with each step, wrapping around me like a living thing. And then I saw it. Through the mist, just ahead, was the outline of a structure. It was small and square, its edges blurred by the fog, but unmistakably there. A cabin! My first thought was relief. Shelter. Maybe even help. But as I approached, that relief turned to dread. The cabin was old, its wooden walls gray and splintered. The roof sagged in places, and the windows were dark, their glass panes cracked or missing entirely. A faded red door hung slightly ajar, swaying gently in the breeze. The closer I got, the more the air seemed to hum with the same low vibration I'd heard the night before. I hesitated at the edge of the clearing, torn between the instinct to turn back and the need to investigate. The cabin felt like it was pulling me in, a magnetic force I couldn't resist. I took a step forward, then another. The hum grew louder with each step, reverberating in my chest like the beat of a drum. When I reached the porch, I noticed something strange. The ground around the cabin was covered in those same grooves I'd seen by the creek, deep and erratic, as if something heavy had been dragged through. I pushed the door open with the end of my flashlight, its rusty hinges groaning in protest. The inside was dim, lit only by the weak gray light filtering through the fog. The first thing I noticed was the smell. It was a pungent mix of damp wood, decaying leaves, and something else, something metallic, like rusted iron. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and I had to cover my nose with my sleeve to keep from gagging. The cabin was empty, or at least it appeared to be at first glance. A single wooden table stood in the center of the room, its surface covered in dust and cobwebs. The walls were lined with shelves, most of them empty, but one held a row of glass jars filled with murky, unidentifiable liquids. My eyes were drawn to the far corner, where a bundle of fabric lay crumpled on the floor. It was dark and stained, and as I stepped closer, I realized it wasn't fabric at all. It was clothing, a jacket, a pair of boots, and something that looked like a backpack. My chest tightened as I recognized the brand of the boots. They were the same as mine. I turned back toward the door, my instincts screaming at me to leave, but something stopped me. A sound. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but unmistakably human, a low, shuddering breath. I froze, my flashlight beam scanning the room. The sound came again, this time from beneath the floorboards. I knelt by the table, pressing my ear to the wooden floor. The breath was louder now, ragged and uneven, accompanied by a soft, scraping noise. There was something or someone beneath the cabin. I stood quickly, my mind racing. The totem, the grooves in the ground, the hum in the air, it all felt connected, though I couldn't piece it together. I backed toward the door, my eyes darting to the corners of the room, half expecting something to emerge from the shadows. The hum was almost deafening now, a relentless vibration that seemed to come from everywhere at once. And then the floor creaked behind me. I spun around, flashlight trembling in my hand. The cabin was empty, but I wasn't alone. The floor creaked again, sharper this time, as if something heavy had shifted beneath the cabin. My flashlight wavered, its beam dancing erratically over the walls. My breathing grew shallow, every muscle in my body screaming for me to run, but my legs felt rooted to the spot. The hum that had been growing louder since I entered the cabin was now a relentless roar, vibrating through the walls and floor, reverberating in my chest. It felt alive, as if the cabin itself were pulsing with some dark energy. And then, the trapdoor revealed itself. It wasn't obvious at first, a subtle seam in the floorboards, directly beneath the table, but now it seemed to radiate menace, the edges of the wood faintly glowing with a sickly, greenish way. The ragged breathing from below grew louder, more labored, as if whoever or whatever was beneath the floor could sense my presence. My flashlight flickered and then died, plunging the cabin into near darkness. I fumbled with it, smacking it against my palm in desperation, but it refused to come back to life. The only light now came from the faint glow of the trapdoor, casting long, jagged shadows across the room. I stepped back, my heart pounding in my ears. "Hello?" I called out, my voice cracking. "Is someone there?" A long, agonizing silence followed. Then, from beneath the floor, came a voice. "It's not safe." The words were barely audible, rasped out between shallow breaths. It sounded human, but there was something off about it, something that made my skin crawl. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice trembling. "What's going on here?" No response. Just that same, labored breathing. I took another step back, my heel catching on one of the grooves in the floor. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was hearing, of what I had seen. The totem, the grooves, the hum, none of it added up. And then the trapdoor began to move. At first, it was just a slight tremor, the wood vibrating beneath the table. But soon, it started to lift, the glow intensifying as it creaked open. I froze, my eyes locked on the widening gap. A hand emerged, first pale, thin and unnaturally long. The fingers were twisted, the nails blackened and jagged, as if they'd been clawing at the wood for years. The rest of the figure followed, pulling itself out of the trapdoor with slow, deliberate movements. It was humanoid, but wrong in every conceivable way. Its limbs were too long, its skin stretched tight over angular bones. Its eyes were black pits, empty and endless, and its mouth twisted into a grotesque grin, revealing rows of sharp, uneven teeth. The hum reached a deafening crescendo, the air vibrating so violently that I could feel it in my teeth. The figure turned its head toward me, moving in a way that was both fluid and mechanical, as if it were mimicking human motion, but didn't quite understand how. I stumbled back, crashing into one of the shelves and sending the jars toppling to the floor. The sound of shattering glass was drowned out by the creature's voice. "You shouldn't have come." Its voice was layered, as if multiple people were speaking in unison. It stepped closer, its movements slow but purposeful, the glow from the trapdoor casting its grotesque shadow across the room. Panic overtook me. I grabbed the nearest object, a broken piece of wood from the shelf, and held it out in front of me like a weapon. "Stay back," I shouted, though my voice wavered with fear. The creature tilted its head, as if amused by my defiance. "You can't leave," it said, its grin widening. "Not now." I glanced toward the door, calculating my chances of escape. The path was clear, but the creature was between me and freedom. Then, without warning, it lunged. I barely had time to react, swinging the piece of wood with all my strength. It struck the creature's arm, but the impact did nothing. The wood splintered in my hands, and the creature didn't even flinch. Its hand shot out, grabbing my wrist with a grip like iron. The cold of its touch was unbearable, seeping into my skin and spreading through my body like ice. I screamed, twisting and pulling, but it was no use. The creature's grip tightened, its black eyes locking onto mine. For a moment, I felt something pulling at me, not physically, but mentally, as if it were reaching into my mind, peeling back layers of thought and memory. Images flashed before me, fragments of the forest, the totem, the grooves in the ground. But there were other images too, ones I didn't recognize. A figure standing in the fog, a circle of people around the totem, their faces obscured, and something massive and shapeless rising from the ground. The creature leaned in close, its breath cold against my face. "You've seen too much," it said, its voice echoing in my mind. And then, just as suddenly as it had grabbed me, it let go. I fell backward, gasping for air, my wrist throbbing with pain. The creature stepped back toward the trapdoor, its form dissolving into the greenish glow. As it sank into the floor, its voice echoed one last time. "Leave, before it's too late." The trapdoor slammed shut, and the hum ceased instantly. The cabin was silent once more, the oppressive stillness returning like a suffocating blanket. I didn't wait to catch my breath. I scrambled to my feet and bolted for the door, my legs trembling beneath me. The fog outside was just as thick as before, but I didn't care. I ran. I sprinted through the fog, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my heart pounding as though it might burst from my chest. Every instinct screamed at me to get as far away from the cabin as possible. My legs ached and my lungs burned, but I didn't dare slow down. The forest around me seemed even darker now, the towering trees twisting in the faint light like grotesque sentinels. The oppressive silence had returned, broken only by the crunch of leaves and twigs beneath my boots. The hum was gone, but its memory lingered, vibrating faintly in the back of my mind. I didn't know how far I had run or in which direction, but eventually, the sight of a familiar clearing stopped me in my tracks. It was the spot where I'd first noticed the grooves in the earth. My stomach churned as I scanned the ground, half expecting the totem to reappear. But the grooves were still there, silent and undisturbed, the forest around them unnaturally still. I backed away, my pulse quickening as I felt the weight of unseen eyes pressing down on me again. The struggle to escape. Panic bubbled up as I realized I wasn't sure how to find my way back to the trailhead. The fog had thickened, swallowing up any landmarks I might have used to orient myself. My phone was still in my pocket, but when I pulled it out, the screen was cracked and lifeless. For a moment, I stood frozen, clutching the useless device, my mind racing. Could I retrace my steps? Would I stumble back toward the cabin instead? The thought sent a chill down my spine. Desperation set in, and I forced myself to move, choosing a direction at random. My legs felt heavy, my movements sluggish, as if the forest itself were resisting my escape. Shadows flickered at the edges of my vision, shapes shifting just out of reach. I stumbled over roots and rocks, my ears straining for any sound other than my own labored breathing. The minutes stretched into an eternity, and with every step, the weight of the forest's oppressive silence grew heavier. Finding the trail. When I finally emerged onto the faint path I'd followed earlier, relief washed over me like a tidal wave. It was the same trail I'd taken that morning, the grooves in the earth unmistakable, even in the dim light. I didn't pause to question how I'd found it or why it seemed to lead in the right direction. I followed the path with single-minded determination, my thoughts consumed by the need to get out of the woods. The fog began to thin, the trees gradually giving way to patches of open sky. The sight of sunlight filtering through the branches filled me with a flicker of hope. though it did little to erase the gnawing fear in my chest. Emerging from the woods, when I finally broke through the tree line and into the clearing where I parked my car, I nearly collapsed with relief. The vehicle was just as I'd left it, its dark silhouette a beacon of safety in the fading light. Fumbling with my keys, I climbed into the driver's seat and slammed the door shut behind me. For the first time in hours, I felt a sense of security, though the shadows of the forest still seemed to stretch toward me, as if unwilling to let me go. I started the engine and peeled out of the clearing, the tires kicking up dirt and leaves as I sped away. My hands trembled on the wheel, and I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the cabin or worse, the creature lurking behind me. Back in civilization, by the time I reached the nearest town, the sun had dipped below the horizon, and the streetlights cast long, flickering shadows across the pavement. I pulled into a gas station parking lot and parked under the harsh glow of the overhead lights. I sat there for a long time, gripping the steering wheel, my mind replaying the events of the day in a chaotic loop. The creature's voice echoed in my ears, its chilling words etched into my memory. "You've seen too much." After what felt like an eternity, I stepped out of the car and headed inside. The cashier greeted me with a casual nod, their expression betraying no hint of the strange world I'd just escaped. The banality of the moment was jarring, but also grounding. I bought a bottle of water and sat in the corner of the store, trying to collect myself. My reflection in the window caught my eye, pale, haggard, and haunted. The mark on my wrist where the creature had grabbed me was faint but visible, a dark bruise spreading across the skin like an unwelcome reminder. Unanswered questions. I wanted to call someone to explain what had happened, but the words wouldn't come. How could I describe the unexplainable? How could I convey the terror of what I'd seen and felt? Even now, sitting in the harsh fluorescent light of the gas station, the events of the day felt surreal, like a nightmare that had bled into reality. But the bruise on my wrist was proof that it wasn't just my imagination. I couldn't shake the feeling that the cabin and whatever was beneath it was still out there, hidden in the depths of the forest, waiting for the next unfortunate soul to stumble upon it. A lingering presence. As I drove home, the roads dark and empty, the silence of the night pressed down on me. Every shadow seemed to move, every flicker of light a reminder of the glowing trapdoor and the creature that had emerged from it. When I finally reached my apartment, I locked the door behind me and collapsed onto the couch, too exhausted to do anything but sit and stare at the wall. Sleep felt impossible. The memory of the creature's grin burned into my mind. The bruise on my wrist throbbed faintly, a cold ache that wouldn't go away. I wrapped it in a bandage, as if that might somehow erase the connection to whatever I had encountered in the woods. But deep down, I knew the forest hadn't let me go entirely. The hum, the grooves, the totem, they were all part of something larger, something ancient and unknowable. And though I had escaped the cabin, I couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't escaped it. The forest had marked me, and I knew I would never be the same. Back in the safety of my apartment, the night stretched long and heavy. The distant hum of traffic outside my window was a stark contrast to the silence that had gripped the forest. Yet even surrounded by familiar sights and sounds, I couldn't shake the sense of unease that had taken root deep within me. I spent hours sitting on the couch, my thoughts spiraling in a chaotic loop. Every detail of the cabin, the trapdoor, and the creature replayed in my mind, each memory sharp and vivid. Sleep was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that glowing trapdoor and the malevolent grin that had emerged from its depths. When dawn finally arrived, the first rays of sunlight filtering through the blinds, I felt a fleeting sense of relief. Morning had always been a symbol of renewal, of safety. But this time, it felt different, hollow. The light did little to chase away the darkness that lingered within me. Over the next few days, I found myself compulsively researching the area where I had been hiking. The forest, the cabin, anything that might offer some kind of explanation. Old maps, obscure forums, and local legends became my constant companions. I found mentions of disappearances in the region, whispers of an unseen force that had supposedly driven people to madness. Some spoke of cursed land, while others suggested ancient rituals tied to the grooves I had seen in the forest. But none of it felt concrete, and none of it came close to explaining what I had encountered. The bruise on my wrist faded slowly, but the mark it left on my psyche remained. It was as if the creature had left a part of itself with me, a shadow that followed me wherever I went. Life went on, but it was never the same. The mundane routines that had once brought me comfort now felt alien. I avoided the woods entirely, the thought of stepping foot near any forest sending a shiver down my spine. Even the sight of a hiking trail on social media was enough to make my stomach turn. Friends noticed the change in me. They asked questions, expressed concern, but I couldn't bring myself to share the full story. How could I explain something so otherworldly without sounding insane? Instead, I gave vague answers about a traumatic hiking experience and changed the subject. But the nights were the hardest. The hum, faint and distant, seemed to return whenever I was alone in the dark. It wasn't loud, barely perceptible, but it was there a reminder that the forest hadn't truly let me go. Looking back, I've tried to make sense of what happened, to find some kind of lesson or meaning in the terror I experienced. But the truth is, not everything can be explained. Some things exist beyond our understanding, defying logic and reason. The forest was a place I had once loved, a source of peace and solitude. Now it felt like a portal to something darker, something I could never fully grasp. And while I had escaped physically, a part of me was still trapped there, standing on the threshold of that glowing trapdoor, staring into the abyss. The forest still calls to me sometimes, not with its usual tranquility, but with something darker, more insistent. I've learned to ignore it, to turn away from the pull, but I know it's still there, waiting. And so, I leave you with this. Be careful where your curiosity leads you. The world is vast and full of mysteries, and not all of them are meant to be uncovered. Sometimes, the unknown is better left undisturbed. It all started during one of those endless summer days in the heart of the wilderness. My name's Chris, and I've been a forest ranger for almost a decade. I always thought of my job as straightforward, protecting the land, ensuring hikers stayed safe, and keeping the forest in balance. But there are things the woods can teach you, lessons that stick with you in ways you wish they wouldn't. The forest I work in stretches for miles, an expansive, rugged terrain tucked away from the chaos of city life. Pine trees tower overhead, their scent heavy in the air. Streams carve through the landscape, their sounds masking the eerie silence that creeps in at night. By day, it feels alive with chirping birds and rustling leaves. By night, it feels different, as if the forest has secrets it doesn't want to share. I was stationed at a small ranger outpost. It wasn't much, just a one-room cabin with a radio, a map, and a worn-out cart for those late shifts. My partner on most patrols was Kyle, another ranger who'd been working the forest for just as long. Kyle was the practical one. He didn't entertain the superstitions locals whispered about the forest. I envied that about him. We had a routine. Every morning, we'd check our equipment, plot our route on the map, and head out to patrol the trails. Most days were uneventful. We'd find the occasional stray camper who wandered off the beaten path or clear a fallen tree blocking a trail. It was predictable, safe. That day started like any other. The sun was already high by the time we set out, the heat making the air feel heavy. I remember checking my boots twice before leaving the cabin, tightening the laces in anticipation of the long hike ahead. Kyle joked about me being too cautious, but I shrugged it off. It's not paranoia if it keeps you safe. We decided to take one of the lesser-used trails that day, a narrow path winding through a dense section of the forest. It was known for its beauty, a photographer's dream, with moss-covered rocks and sunlight filtering through the trees like something out of a postcard. But it was also remote, rarely traveled except by wildlife and the occasional daring hiker. The forest was calm that morning, with nothing but the sound of our boots crunching against the dirt path. Birds flitted between the branches, and a squirrel darted across the trail ahead of us. The usual signs of life were everywhere, and for the first few hours, everything seemed normal. Kyle and I didn't talk much as we walked. We didn't need to. There was a quiet understanding between us, a rhythm we'd fallen into over the years. I focused on the surroundings, scanning for anything out of place, a broken branch, unusual tracks, anything that might signal trouble. Around noon, we stopped by a stream to take a break. The water was clear and cold, trickling over smooth stones. Kyle leaned against a tree, taking a long sip from his canteen, while I sat on a rock, my eyes drifting over the landscape. I noticed how the light played through the leaves, casting shifting patterns on the ground. It was peaceful, But even then, something felt off. It wasn't anything I could point to, just a faint unease that tugged at the edges of my mind. I shook it off, convincing myself it was just the heat or maybe the exhaustion from the hike. Kyle didn't seem to notice anything. He was always better at staying grounded, at dismissing the small things that gnawed me. When we packed up and continued our patrol, the unease stayed with me, a shadow I couldn't shake. As we delved deeper into the forest, the trees grew denser, their branches intertwining above us to form a canopy that blocked out the sun. The air grew cooler, heavier, carrying a faint scent of damp earth. Kyle cracked a joke about the enchanted part of the forest, trying to lighten the mood. I chuckled half-heartedly, but I couldn't shake the sensation that we were being watched. I kept glancing over my shoulder, my eyes scanning the shadows between the trees. Each time, there was nothing there. The day stretched on, and we kept moving, our boots crunching over leaves and twigs. The unease had dulled, but it never completely disappeared. It was just a normal day, I told myself. Just another patrol through the woods, or so I thought. We had been walking for a few hours when the first strange thing happened. The trail we were following was one we'd patrolled many times before, a narrow, winding path through some of the densest parts of the forest. It wasn't a well-trodden route, but we knew it like the back of our hands. Or so we thought. As we rounded a familiar bend, Kyle stopped abruptly. He tilted his head, looking down at the trail ahead. I followed his gaze and noticed what had caught his attention. The dirt path was littered with deep, irregular grooves, as if something heavy had been dragged through it. The marks were fresh, cutting through the leaf litter and exposing the darker soil underneath. "What do you make of that?" Kyle asked, crouching down to get a closer look. I stepped closer, my eyes narrowing as I studied the marks. They were too deep and wide to be from an animal, and too erratic to be the result of something like a fallen tree being moved. The grooves crisscrossed each other, creating a chaotic pattern that didn't make sense. "Doesn't look like tracks," I muttered. Kyle shook his head. "No, but something came through here." We both scanned the area, our eyes darting between the trees. The forest was still, almost unnaturally so. The usual background hum of birds and insects was gone, replaced by a heavy silence that pressed against my ears. Kyle was the first to break the tension. "Probably just some campers messing around," he said, straightening up. He tried to sound nonchalant, but I could hear the edge in his voice. "Maybe," I replied, though I wasn't convinced. We decided to follow the marks, letting them guide us deeper into the forest. As we walked, the grooves became more erratic, zigzagging across the trail and leading us off the beaten path. The farther we went, the stranger they became, eventually leading us to a small clearing surrounded by towering pines. The clearing was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that feels wrong, like the forest itself was holding its breath. In the center of the clearing was a pile of rocks, stacked haphazardly, but with an unsettling precision. They varied in size, from small stones to larger ones that must have taken significant effort to move. Kyle let out a low whistle. "That's weird," he said, walking toward the pile. I hung back, my stomach twisting in a way I couldn't explain. There was something about the rocks that felt off. They weren't arranged randomly. There was an intentionality to their placement, as if someone or something had built them for a purpose. "Think it's some kind of marker?" Kyle asked, running his hand over one of the larger stones. "Could be," I replied, though the words felt hollow. As Kyle examined the pile, I circled the clearing, my eyes scanning the perimeter. The trees here seemed older, their trunks thick and gnarled, their branches intertwined above, casting deep shadows that seemed to shift and move, even though there was no wind. And then I saw it. Just beyond the edge of the clearing, partially obscured by the underbrush, was something hanging from one of the trees. At first, I thought it was a piece of fabric caught on a branch, but as I got closer, I realized it was something else entirely. It was a small bundle, wrapped in what looked like animal hide and tied with coarse twine. Strange symbols were etched into the surface of the hide, their shapes unfamiliar and unsettling. "Kyle," I called out, my voice tight. He turned, his expression shifting when he saw the look on my face. "What is it?" I pointed to the bundle, and he walked over, his brow furrowing as he took it in. "What the hell is that?" "I don't know," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Kyle reached out as if to touch it, but I grabbed his arm. "Don't," I said quickly. He looked at me, surprised. You think it's dangerous? I don't know what it is, but it doesn't feel right, I said. We stood there for a moment, staring at the bundle as if it might reveal its secrets. The forest around us felt heavier, the air thick with an unspoken tension. Kyle finally broke the silence. We should report this when we get back, he said. Agreed, I replied, my eyes never leaving the bundle. We decided not to disturb it and headed back toward the trail, the unease following us like a shadow. Neither of us spoke much as we walked, each lost in our own thoughts. The forest seemed different now, its familiar trails and landmarks tainted by the strange discovery. When we finally returned to the outpost that evening, Kyle filed a report about the marks and the rock pile, but he left out the part about the bundle. Didn't want to sound crazy, he said with a shrug when I asked him about it. I didn't argue, but that night, as I lay on the cot in the cabin, I couldn't get the image of the bundle out of my mind. The symbols, the way it hung from the tree, it all felt wrong in a way I couldn't explain. I told myself it was probably just some kind of art project or a prank by a group of campers, but deep down, I knew it was something else. The next day started off normal, though the unease from the previous evening lingered. Kyle and I planned to patrol a different area of the forest, hoping to distance ourselves from whatever we'd stumbled upon the day before. We didn't talk much about the bundle or the rock pile, but I could tell it was still on Kyle's mind, just as it was on mine. We set out at first light, the forest bathed in the soft glow of the morning sun. The air was crisp, carrying the earthy scent of pine needles and damp soil. For the first hour or so, everything seemed fine, just another day on the job. But then the sound started. At first, it was subtle, almost imperceptible. A faint rustling in the underbrush that seemed to follow us as we walked. I chalked it up to small animals, rabbits or squirrels, but the sound didn't behave like it should. It was too consistent, too deliberate. Kyle, I said, stopping in my tracks. He turned to look at me, his brow furrowing. You hear that? He nodded slowly. Yeah, been hearing it for a while. We both stood there, listening. The rustling seemed to pause as if it knew we were paying attention. Then, after a few tense moments, it started again, this time from a different direction. Maybe it's just the wind, Kyle suggested, though his tone lacked conviction. There's no wind, I pointed out. He didn't respond, but his hand moved to the radio clip to his belt. Outpost, this is Ranger Kyle. Do you copy? Static crackled in response, but no voice came through. He tried again, with the same result. Great, he muttered, shoving the radio back into its holster. We decided to keep moving, though our pace quickened. The rustling followed us for a while longer before fading away, but the sense of being watched remained. As the day went on, the forest seemed to shift around us. Familiar landmarks appeared distorted or out of place. Trees we'd passed countless times looked different, their bark marked with strange scratches or symbols that hadn't been there before. At one point, we came across a stream that should have been clear and babbling with fresh water. Instead, it was stagnant and dark, its surface coated with an oily sheen. The air around it was thick with a foul smell that made my stomach churn. This is wrong, Kyle said, staring at the water. Yeah, I agreed. We marked the location on our map and moved on, trying to shake off the growing unease. It wasn't long after we left the stream that we encountered something else. A trail of feathers, white and pristine, leading off into the trees. Birds, maybe? Kyle suggested, though his voice was uncertain. I crouched down to inspect them. They were too perfect, too clean. There was no blood, no sign of a struggle. Just a neat line of feathers stretching into the distance. Should we follow it? Kyle asked. I hesitated before nodding. We need to figure out what's going on out here. We followed the trail for what felt like miles, the forest growing darker and more oppressive with each step. The trees seemed to lean closer together, their branches forming a tangled canopy that blocked out the sunlight. The air was heavy, making it hard to breathe. Then we saw it, a clearing up ahead, bathed in an eerie, unnatural light. The clearing was smaller than the one we'd found the day before, but it was no less unsettling. At its center was another rock pile, almost identical to the first, but this one had something else, a circle of feathers surrounding it. Kyle and I exchanged a glance before stepping into the clearing. The moment we did, The forest seemed to go silent again, the same oppressive stillness we'd felt before. "What is this?" Kyle asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," I replied, though my heart was pounding. As we approached the rock pile, I noticed something else. Etched into the ground around it were more symbols, similar to the ones on the bundle we'd seen the day before. They were crude and uneven, but they radiated an unsettling energy. Kyle reached out to touch one of the rocks, and I grabbed his arm again. "Don't," I said sharply. He looked at me, startled, but didn't argue. We didn't stay long in the clearing. There was something about it that felt wrong, like we were intruding on something we weren't meant to see. As we made our way back to the trail, the forest came alive with sound, but not the kind we were used to. Faint whispers drifted through the trees, too quiet to make out the words, but loud enough to send shivers down my spine. "Do you hear that?" Kyle asked, his voice trembling. I nodded, gripping the strap of my backpack tightly. "Yeah." We quickened our pace, the whispers growing louder as we went. They seemed to come from all around us, echoing through the forest like a taunt. By the time we reached the outpost, we were both on edge. We didn't talk much as we filed our report, sticking to the facts and leaving out the parts that would make us sound crazy. But that night, as I lay in bed, the whispers echoed in my mind, refusing to let me sleep. Whatever was happening in the forest, it wasn't over, and I had a feeling it was only going to get worse. The tension in the forest reached its peak the following day. Kyle and I had tried to shake off the growing dread, but it was impossible to ignore. Every step we took felt heavier, as if the very ground beneath us was resisting our presence. There was an undeniable heaviness in the air, a weight that pressed down on us both. The whispers had returned, faint but ever present, hanging in the trees like an unseen presence. We hadn't spoken much since the day before. I could sense that Kyle was as shaken as I was, though neither of us was willing to admit it. The days of routine patrols and mundane tasks seemed like distant memories now, replaced by the unnerving presence that had settled in the forest. Our shift began like any other, but the moment we set foot in the woods, something felt off. The sky was overcast, casting a dim pall over the forest. The rustling sounds from the underbrush seemed louder today, and once again, the eerie silence would follow when we stopped to listen. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. We moved forward cautiously, the same sense of being watched settling over us. It wasn't just the rustling, the whispers, or the strange rock piles we'd encountered. It was the very air the forest had changed. Everything felt unnatural, and that creeping sense of dread clung to every step. As we ventured deeper into the forest, something caught my eye. There, just ahead, was the outline of something in the trees. I squinted, trying to make it out, but it was too far to see clearly. "Kyle," I called, my voice low. "Do you see that?" He stopped and followed my gaze, his expression darkening. "I see it," he muttered. "Let's go check it out." We approached cautiously, the crackling underfoot echoing louder than usual in the oppressive silence. As we drew closer, the shape became clearer. It was another pile of rocks. But this time, it was different. The rocks were arranged in a perfect circle, and at the center, something gleamed in the dim light. I moved closer, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. In the center of the circle was a bundle, wrapped in the same crude cloth we'd seen before. This time, however, something was off. The bundle seemed alive, twitching slightly as though something inside was moving. "Stay back," Kyle whispered, his hand resting on the grip of his rifle. His eyes were wide, his fear palpable. "We don't know what this is." I nodded, but the curiosity was eating at me. I couldn't stop myself from inching closer. "Don't touch it," Kyle urged. But it was too late. I reached out, my fingers trembling as I touched the cloth. The moment my fingers made contact, the world around me seemed to shift. The forest, which had been unnervingly still, erupted into motion. The wind picked up, howling through the trees like a scream. The ground beneath us shook violently, as if the very earth itself was rebelling. The trees groaned, their trunks creaking as they bent unnaturally in the wind. But the worst was yet to come. A low, guttural sound echoed from within the bundle. It wasn't a voice, it was something worse, something primal. It sent a shiver down my spine, and I felt a cold sweat break out on my skin. I stumbled back, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. The bundle burst open. Inside, there was no body, no flesh, no bones. What I saw instead was a mass of squirming tendrils, a writhing mass of something that defied all logic. The tendrils reached out, thrashing violently, as though seeking something, anything. I stumbled back in horror, nearly tripping over my own feet as I retreated. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and my heart raced as fear surged through me. "Kyle!" I screamed, my voice hoarse. "Get back!" But Kyle was frozen in place. His eyes were wide, his face pale. I could see the terror in them as he watched the grotesque sight unfold. The tendrils shot toward us, faster than I thought possible. I grabbed Kyle, pulling him away with all my strength, but he was heavy, his body stiff with fear. The tendrils were close now, and I felt the air grow colder as they reached for us, brushing against the trees, the rocks, and the ground. But then, as suddenly as it had started, everything stopped. The wind died down, the ground stopped shaking, and the forest returned to its eerie silence. I stood there, gasping for breath, my heart pounding in my chest. Kyle was still frozen, his eyes locked on the spot where the bundle had once been, but the tendrils were gone. The rocks lay undisturbed. The bundle, too, had vanished. "What the hell was that?" Kyle whispered, his voice barely audible. I didn't have an answer. I couldn't even comprehend what we had just witnessed, but I knew one thing for certain. Whatever we had stumbled upon, it wasn't human, and it wasn't something that belonged in this world. We ran. We didn't look back. We didn't stop until we were back at the outpost, where the safety of the lights and the sound of other people made the horror of what we'd just seen seem almost impossible. But as the day wore on, as I lay in my bunk staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest wasn't finished with us yet. It had shown us its worst, but there was more to come. And whatever it wasn't done with the forest or with us. The whispers were still there, lingering at the edges of my mind. The night after our horrifying encounter in the forest was one of silence. Kyle and I barely spoke a word as we sat in the small outpost, staring at the walls and listening to the faint hum of the radio. The tension in the air was thick, suffocating, but neither of us could bring ourselves to leave. The memories of what we had seen, those writhing tendrils, that unnatural silence clung to our thoughts like a dark fog. Despite the terror we'd experienced, neither of us had been able to sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I could see those tendrils reaching toward me, hear that guttural, inhuman noise reverberating through my skull. The forest had become an entity in itself, alive, breathing, watching us. What do we do now? Kyle's voice broke the silence. His tone was hollow, as if the weight of what we'd witnessed had taken its toll on him, just as it had on me. I didn't have an answer. There were no words that could make sense of what had happened, no explanations that could erase the horror from our minds. The forest, once a place of routine patrols, had become something else entirely, something we were no longer prepared to understand. The radio crackled to life, and we both jumped, startled by the sudden sound. It was the station dispatcher, asking if everything was all right with the two of us. Kyle glanced at me, then grabbed the receiver. "We're fine," Kyle said, his voice shaky. "Just had a bit of a situation. We'll report back later." There was a pause on the other end of the line, but the dispatcher didn't push further. They were used to hearing strange stories from rangers in the field. They'd never asked too many questions, and Kyle didn't want to give them any reason to doubt us. "Roger that," came the reply. "Stay safe out there." Kyle hung up the receiver, his hand lingering on it as if he was trying to find something to hold on to. "You know we can't stay here," I said, my voice low. "We have to get out of here, Kyle. That thing, whatever it was, it's still out there." He didn't answer right away, but I could see the conflict in his eyes. We had a duty to the land, to the job, but that job had become something else entirely. We couldn't ignore what we had witnessed. The forest had changed, and so had we. What do we even tell them? Kyle muttered, rubbing his hands over his face. What do we say happened out there? Who would believe us? That was the problem. I couldn't even begin to explain what had happened in a way that made sense. Words felt insufficient. The reality of what we'd encountered so far beyond the realm of normal that there was no way to communicate it to anyone without sounding insane. "We don't," I said quietly. We leave. Let someone else deal with it. The thought of facing whatever was still out there in the woods was almost unbearable, but I knew it was the only choice we had left. We packed our things in silence. There was no conversation about what had happened or what we had seen. We just moved, the weight of our fear making our movements slow and deliberate. The outpost had become a prison, the walls closing in on us with each passing minute. As we loaded the truck, I couldn't help but glance back toward the forest. The dark shapes of the trees seemed to loom over us, casting long shadows in the dim light. I half expected to see those strange rock piles again, or to hear the rustle of unseen creatures in the brush. But there was nothing. The forest seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for us to leave. We drove out of the station, the truck's tires crunching over the gravel as we pulled away. For the first time in hours, I felt a flicker of relief. The oppressive atmosphere lifted slightly, and I could almost convince myself that we were safe. But the feeling didn't last. I looked over at Kyle, who had his hands tightly gripping the steering wheel. His knuckles were white, his jaw clenched with tension. "You all right?" I asked. Kyle didn't respond immediately, his gaze fixed straight ahead. I could see the weight of the situation pressing down on him, the uncertainty in his eyes. "I don't know, man," he finally muttered. "I keep thinking about it, the thing we saw in the woods. I don't know what it was, or what it wanted." I didn't have an answer for him. I didn't have any answers for myself. What had happened out there wasn't something I could explain away. It wasn't just an animal or a trick of the light. That thing in the bundle, it was something else, something ancient, something that had no place in our world. The further we drove, the more the silence between us grew. We were both lost in our thoughts, struggling to process the impossible. We passed through the small town nearby, the lights of the houses offering a false sense of normalcy. People were going about their lives, completely unaware of the darkness that had taken root in the forest. As we neared the highway, I felt a strange, undeniable compulsion to look back one last time. And there, in the rearview mirror, I saw it. The trees, the same dark shapes that had loomed over us earlier. But now, they were different, more twisted, more alive. The forest seemed to pulse, as though it were watching us leave. I quickly turned away, focusing on the road ahead. We drove for hours, not stopping until we reached the safety of a nearby ranger station. The lights were bright, the sounds of human life comforting in a way I hadn't realized I needed. But even as I stepped into the station, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't truly safe. The forest was still out there. And whatever it was, whatever we had encountered, it was still waiting. As I lay in my bed that night, the sounds of the station filling the air, I couldn't sleep. My mind raced with thoughts of the forest, of the tendrils, of the fear that had clawed at me in the woods. I thought of the bundle, of the creature inside, and the overwhelming sensation that we were only scratching the surface of something far darker. But there was nothing more I could do. We had fled. We had left the forest behind. And yet, I couldn't escape the feeling that it was only a matter of time before the forest would come calling again. Days passed, and the unsettling feeling that had settled into the pit of my stomach did not fade. No matter how far we drove, no matter how many miles we put between ourselves and the forest, the images from that night kept resurfacing. The tendrils, the way they moved, how they seemed to pulse with an eerie, unnatural life. My mind replayed those moments over and over again, each time more vivid, more real than the last. I could still hear that low, guttural hum in my ears, feel the unsettling pull of something beyond my understanding. I tried to talk about it with Kyle, but he wasn't much better off than I was. We hadn't even reported what we'd encountered to anyone. Who would believe us? The very thought of describing what we had seen seemed absurd. No one would take us seriously, and it seemed pointless to bring up something so far beyond the realm of normalcy. I found myself withdrawing. I couldn't look at the forest the same way anymore, even when I drove past its edge. It was as though it held a secret, a darkness that was just beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself again. And for all my efforts to push it away, I couldn't escape the nagging suspicion that our encounter wasn't a one-time event. That forest, it was alive, in ways I couldn't explain. I kept my distance from Kyle after that. He stayed in his own head, too. The camaraderie we once shared as coworkers, as rangers, seemed to evaporate with every passing day. The bond we had formed out there in the woods had fractured into something fragile. He was distant, distracted, his once vibrant personality dimmed. I suppose we both understood that whatever had happened out there, whatever we had witnessed, would follow us forever. It was impossible to go back to the way things were before, but as weeks turned into months, life gradually moved on. I tried to distract myself with work, with the daily grind that came with being a ranger, but even that felt different now. Every rustling branch, every gust of wind through the trees set my nerves on edge. Every time the wind howled, I would freeze, waiting for the familiar hum, the unnatural stillness to return. I told myself it was just the shock of what we'd witnessed. It was a traumatic experience, and I was still recovering, but the nagging feeling never quite left. At night, I would lay awake, staring into the darkness of my room, wondering if I was really free of whatever had happened in those woods. Could I ever truly escape it? One evening, I found myself standing in front of the old station where we'd once worked. It was quiet, the kind of silence that feels almost too still. I hadn't been back since we fled that night. I had told myself it was best to leave it all behind, to move on with my life. But now, something drew me back. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the need to face what had happened. But I found myself there nonetheless. The air was thick with the scent of pine and earth, the very smell of the forest we had left behind. As I stood there, a shiver crawled down my spine. It wasn't cold, not exactly, but there was a chill in the air, one that I couldn't shake. The trees stood tall and silent, as though they were watching me. I could almost hear them whispering in the wind. I stepped forward, my boots crunching on the gravel as I walked toward the entrance of the station. The door creaked as I pushed it open, and I was immediately hit with the familiar smell of old wood and dust. The place was abandoned now, a forgotten relic of a past life. But something felt off. The stillness inside was suffocating, as though the space had been holding its breath since we left. And then I heard it. The sound was faint at first, just a low hum in the distance, but it grew louder, clearer, unmistakable. That same hum we had heard that night in the forest. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. It wasn't possible. The forest was miles away. I was no longer in that place, that nightmare. And yet, I heard it, the same deep, unsettling hum, the sound of something ancient and wrong. It pulsed in my ears, a vibration that seemed to sink into my bones. I wanted to turn and run, but my feet wouldn't move. I stood frozen, my mind scrambling for a reason, for an explanation, but there was no rational explanation. The hum was real. It was the same one we had heard in the forest. It was here, now, in the station. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. Silence! I don't know how long I stood there, waiting for something, anything to happen, but nothing did. The hum had faded, leaving only the eerie quiet behind. I could hear the faint sound of my own breathing, ragged and shallow. I left that night, leaving behind the station and the questions I couldn't answer. I didn't turn back, didn't look over my shoulder. The hum had followed me, yes, but I didn't need to know why. I didn't need to understand. I had come to realize that some things, some truths were better left alone. The forest still haunted me, but I knew I couldn't outrun it. It was there, in the very air I breathed, in the silence that followed me wherever I went. Maybe it wasn't finished with me. Maybe it was always going to be a part of me, a shadow in the periphery of my mind. And so, I've kept moving, kept going. I try to live my life, to push the memories of that night away, but there are times when I can feel the weight of it, the hum, the darkness, the feeling that I'm still being watched. In the end, I don't know if I'll ever be truly free from it. Maybe none of us are. The forest has a way of staying with you long after you've left it behind. And somewhere, deep in the woods, I'm sure it's still waiting. This is the kind of story that's just close enough to reality to make you think, could this really happen? It's the kind of tale that might keep you up long after the lights go out. You know, the ones that have a way of sticking with you long after you've heard them. So, sit back, relax, and let's begin. It was late autumn when we decided to go camping in the woods. The trees had just begun to shed their leaves, and there was a chill in the air that made the warmth of the campfire all the more inviting. We were a small group, just 4 friends, out to escape the demands of the city and spend a weekend in the solitude of nature. The world had been moving too fast, and we were all looking for a little peace, a little silence, time away from the noise of our everyday lives. It was my idea, of course. I had always loved the outdoors. There was something about the simplicity of it, the crisp air, the stillness, the way everything felt grounded and real that called to me. So, when I brought up the idea of a weekend camping trip, the others jumped at the chance. They were all eager for the break too, so we packed up our gear and made our way to a remote spot in the forest, a place I had camped in years ago, a place where time seemed to slow down. The campgrounds were tucked away off a winding road, far from the nearest town. No cell service, no distractions. The perfect escape. We arrived in the late afternoon, and the sun was already beginning its slow descent behind the trees. The forest was alive with the sounds of the evening birds calling out to each other, the rustling of leaves in the breeze, the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. It was peaceful, serene, normal, even. The group consisted of me, the planner and lover of the outdoors, my longtime friend Ethan, a quiet but dependable guy, and then there was Olivia and Ben, who had both just recently joined our circle. Olivia was full of energy, always laughing and cracking jokes, while Ben was more reserved, the type who was always thinking things through. Together, we made an unlikely but functional group. We had spent countless hours together over the years, and I felt certain this trip would be no different. We set up camp by a small clearing, where we could catch a glimpse of the fading light through the trees. The campfire crackled to life as we gathered around, unpacking our gear. The scent of burning wood filled the air, and we shared stories from home, keeping the conversation light. The sound of the fire, the way the flames danced in the darkness, the way the night seemed to wrap itself around us, it all felt comforting, like we were safe from the world outside. As night fell, we settled into our tents, the forest now bathed in shadows. The moonlight filtered through the canopy of trees above, casting an eerie glow over the camp. The only sound now was the occasional rustle of the wind and the distant call of a nocturnal animal. But even then, it didn't feel unsettling. It was just nature, quiet and still, just the way I liked it. It was a routine weekend, nothing out of the ordinary, but something about the place felt off. Maybe it was just the isolation, or maybe it was the way the wind whistled through the trees, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't completely alone. It was a passing thought, nothing more, and I quickly dismissed it. After all, we were in the middle of nowhere. The kind of place where you'd expect peace, not whatever that strange feeling was. Still, it lingered in the back of my mind, though I didn't mention it to the others. We spent the evening around the campfire, laughing, telling stories, and talking about everything and nothing. The shadows grew longer, and the chill in the air seemed to deepen, but we were too wrapped up in the warmth of the fire and each other's company to care. As the fire slowly burned down to embers, we decided to head to bed, eager to rest for the next day's hike. The night felt normal. At least, at that point, it did. But when I crawled into my sleeping bag that night, I heard something strange, a faint sound. I couldn't place it, and it seemed distant, almost like something was scratching at the sides of my tent. It wasn't loud, just a soft, repetitive noise. It only lasted a few moments, and when I listened harder, it stopped. I chalked it up to the wind, maybe a branch brushing against the tent. That made sense. I closed my eyes, telling myself it was nothing, and drifted off to sleep. It wasn't until the next morning that things started to change. The air felt different, heavier, and something about the place seemed off. It was the kind of feeling you get when you walk into a room and suddenly realize someone's been there before you, someone you didn't expect, someone who shouldn't have been there. It was subtle, just a hint of unease that I couldn't shake. But we were here for a good time, right? A little weirdness wouldn't hurt. At least, that's what I told myself. We gathered around the fire again, making breakfast, but I couldn't ignore the growing sense of discomfort. The others seemed oblivious to it, chatting and laughing as if everything was just fine. I tried to focus on the task at hand, cooking, setting up for the hike, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Something was different. And then, in the middle of all this normalcy, that's when we found it. Hidden beneath a pile of leaves near the edge of the camp, just behind my tent, was an old journal. Its pages were yellowed with age, its leather cover worn and cracked. The journal looked out of place here, this deep in the woods, this far from civilization. I picked it up, dusted it off, and flipped it open. It was someone's handwriting, neat, almost too neat for someone who might have been living off the grid. The first entry caught my eye immediately. I don't know how much longer I can stay here. The woods are changing, and I don't feel safe anymore. The others don't seem to notice, but I do. I hear things in the night, things that shouldn't be there, and they're getting closer. The words sent a shiver down my spine, but that was just the beginning. The journal was, in itself, an unsettling discovery. Its worn cover and mysterious presence seemed almost to call out for attention, but at first we dismissed it as nothing more than a relic left behind by previous campers. We speculated about its owner, wondering whether it had been left by someone who had stayed at the same campsite years before. The pages inside seemed to tell a tale of some troubled soul, perhaps a wanderer or an adventurer who had experienced something extraordinary during their time in the woods. I sat down with it by the campfire as the others began preparing for our hike. The warm glow of the flames flickered in the growing dusk, casting shadows that seemed to dance in the corners of my vision. The journal seemed to almost pulse in my hands, each word on the yellowed pages carrying a weight that was hard to explain. My fingers hovered over the paper as I read more of the entries, but I didn't get far before Olivia's voice broke through the silence. "Hey, are you coming?" she called, holding up a map and looking at me expectantly. "We've got a trail to follow." I glanced up at her, forcing a smile as I slipped the journal back into the bag and stood up. "Yeah, just a second. I'll be right there," I said, trying to shake off the unease that had crept into my chest. The group was eager to get moving, and soon we were hiking along the well-trodden path through the woods. The trail was beautiful, the trees towering above us, their branches heavy with the last of autumn's leaves. The sun filtered through the canopy in patches, casting beams of light onto the forest floor, which was covered in a carpet of fallen leaves. But even as we walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The journal's words echoed in my mind. I knew it sounded irrational, but I couldn't help it. There was something in the air, something heavy, something that felt out of place. The others didn't seem to notice, though. Olivia was busy snapping pictures, and Ben was lost in thought, his gaze fixed on the distant trees. Ethan, as always, was walking quietly beside me, his hands stuffed in his pockets. The hike itself was uneventful, or so it seemed. The deeper we ventured into the woods, the more I felt like we were leaving behind the world we knew. The forest had this oppressive feeling, as though it was quietly watching us, waiting. It was hard to explain, but as the daylight began to fade, the atmosphere grew thicker, heavier, colder. We stopped for a break in a small clearing about 2 hours into the hike. It was a beautiful spot, with a stream running through it and a few large rocks we could sit on. I took a seat on one of the rocks and leaned back, looking up at the sky, which had begun to turn a deep shade of purple. The air was cool now, and the silence of the forest was profound. That's when I noticed it. At first, it was subtle, almost imperceptible. The way the trees around the clearing seemed to shift in the wind, though there was no breeze to speak of. The leaves rustled lightly, but there was no sound of the wind that would typically cause such a movement. It was as if the forest itself was shifting, bending slightly, like a living thing. "Did you guys see that?" I asked, standing up quickly. Ethan, who had been sitting nearby, looked over at me, brow furrowed. "See what?" "The trees. They were moving, but there's no wind," I said, feeling a strange unease settle in my stomach. Olivia and Ben glanced around, but the trees were still again, their branches hanging motionless above us. "Probably just the breeze," Ben said, shrugging. "You're imagining things," but I wasn't convinced. There was something wrong, something about the way the air felt around us. It was like the forest itself was holding its breath. I tried to shake it off. "Yeah, you're probably right," I muttered. "Let's get moving." We continued our hike, but the feeling of being watched didn't fade. The further we went, the more aware I became of the unnatural quiet. The usual sounds of the forest birds chirping, leaves rustling, distant animal calls were absent. All that remained was the crunch of our footsteps on the forest floor and the occasional snapping of twigs beneath our feet. By the time we made it back to camp, the sun had dipped below the horizon, and the air had turned noticeably colder. We hurried to light the fire, trying to ward off the chill, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The forest, now bathed in shadows, felt vast and empty, like an unfamiliar place. As we sat around the fire, I found myself glancing over my shoulder more often than usual. The trees at the edge of the clearing were thick with darkness, and the winds had picked up again, but there was something different about it. It wasn't just the usual rustle of leaves. It felt deliberate. I shook my head, trying to focus on the conversation, but my thoughts kept drifting back to the journal and the strange sensations I had experienced throughout the day. I kept telling myself it was nothing, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. We ate a quick dinner, still talking and laughing, though it was starting to feel a little forced. The fire crackled loudly in the silence, and the warmth was a comfort, but it couldn't completely dispel the sense of unease that had settled over us. It wasn't until later that night, after we had all retired to our tents, that the first truly unsettling incident happened. I had just drifted off to sleep when I was jolted awake by a sound. It wasn't loud at first, just a soft rustling noise, like something brushing against the fabric of my tent. At first, I thought it was just the wind again, but then it came again closer this time, a deliberate scraping sound, as if something or someone was trying to get in. My heart began to race, and I sat up in my sleeping bag, straining to listen. The noise was faint, but unmistakable. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. It was something else, something human. I glanced over at the other tents. I could see the faint silhouette of Olivia's form, still and unmoving, through the thin fabric. Ben and Ethan's tents were quiet, their shapes dark and undisturbed. I held my breath, waiting for the sound to stop, but it didn't. The scratching continued, this time followed by a soft tapping sound like something was gently drumming its fingers against the side of the tent. I couldn't ignore it anymore. My hands were trembling as I unzipped the flap of the tent just a little, peering out into the darkness. The clearing was still, empty. No movement, no animals, no wind. Just the fire, still burning low, casting a flickering light across the camp. I stepped out of the tent, trying to move as quietly as possible. My feet felt like lead as I crept closer to the edge of the campsite. The firelight barely reached that far. The shadows in the trees seemed to stretch further, and I could feel my skin prickling with tension. There was nothing but the soft hiss of the embers in the fire and the rustle of the trees. My eyes scanned the dark edges of the forest, but nothing moved. I stood there for a moment, heart pounding in my chest, before I decided I was being ridiculous. There was nothing out there. Nothing at all. But as I turned back toward the tents, I saw it. A figure, just a shape, really standing at the edge of the clearing. It was too dark to make out any features, but it was there, unmistakably. I froze, my breath catching in my throat, and then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure was gone. I rushed back to my tent, heart racing, my mind running wild. I couldn't explain what I had seen. I had to tell the others. I had to make sure I wasn't imagining things. But when I reached the tent, I found that no one was awake. The fire continued to crackle in the night, and the trees, once again, stood silent. But something had changed. I knew it, and so did the others. We couldn't ignore it anymore. The woods were no longer a peaceful escape. They were something else, something dark, something we couldn't yet understand. The following morning, I woke to the sound of a bird calling from somewhere deep in the woods. The usual cheerful chirp had a faint edge to it, almost as if it were a warning. I shook it off and sat up, rubbing my eyes. The camp was still asleep. The sun had barely risen, casting long shadows across the clearing as the early morning mist clung to the trees like a blanket. The fire from the previous night had long since burned out, and the smell of smoke lingered in the air, mixing with the damp, earthy scent of the forest. I could feel the cool bite of the morning air as I pulled my jacket tighter around me. Something about the silence felt heavy, suffocating. I made my way to the small stream that ran through the campsite, the soft gurgle of water the only sound to break the quiet. The water was cold as I cupped my hands to drink, my reflection rippling slightly in the surface as I looked down. For a moment, I allowed myself to forget about the unease that had gripped me since we arrived. But it didn't last long. As I returned to the clearing, I noticed something strange: footprints. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but as I looked closer, I saw the deep impressions in the soft earth. They were fresh, but there was something unsettling about them. They weren't human, or at least not entirely. The toes were too elongated, the heel too sharp. They didn't look like any animal I knew. It was as though something else, something unfamiliar, had been walking around our camp during the night. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I took in the strange pattern. They led off toward the trees, disappearing into the thick underbrush. I stepped back slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. I glanced at the tents, still untouched, and then at the others, still asleep. What had happened here last night? I could feel my breath quicken as I tried to make sense of the strange events. The others began to stir shortly after, one by one. Olivia was the first to emerge from her tent, stretching and yawning as she looked around the campsite. "Morning," she said brightly, but the cheerfulness in her voice didn't quite reach her eyes. She seemed distracted, her gaze flicking nervously toward the trees. "What's with the weird silence? It's almost too quiet." "I was just about to say the same thing," I replied, still staring at the footprints. "And look at this." I pointed to the strange marks in the dirt. Olivia's face went pale as she stepped closer, inspecting the prints. "What the hell is that?" she whispered, a note of fear creeping into her voice. "That's not an animal or a person. What made these? We need to figure out what's going on," I said, my voice low. I could feel the tension in the air thickening as we stood there, unsure of what to do next. Ethan and Ben were soon up, joining us by the campfire. As I showed them the strange footprints, they exchanged uneasy glances. "That's messed up," Ethan muttered, kneeling down to examine the prints more closely. "But it could just be some weird animal we don't know about. I mean, it's the woods. There are all kinds of creatures out here." "Maybe," Ben said, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. "But something feels off. I don't know how to explain it, but there's a sense of being watched, like we're not alone." His words sent a shiver down my spine. That was exactly how I had been feeling. It wasn't just the strange footprints or the way the trees seemed to shift in the wind. It was the constant feeling that we were being observed. And I wasn't sure how much longer I could ignore it. "We should go check it out," I said, nodding toward the trail that the footprints seemed to lead toward. "Maybe we can figure out what's going on." With little else to do, the four of us gathered our things and started walking down the trail, following the strange marks in the dirt. The path seemed to grow darker as we ventured deeper into the woods, the trees closing in around us. The air grew thick and heavy, pressing down on us with every step. It was the kind of quiet that made your skin crawl. As we moved further into the forest, the unease intensified. The woods seemed to stretch on endlessly, the trees looming over us like silent giants. The ground beneath our feet was soft and damp, and the faint smell of decay lingered in the air. I tried to focus on the sound of our footsteps, but it was drowned out by the strange, oppressive silence that had settled over everything. We reached a clearing after what felt like hours of walking, though I couldn't be sure how long it had actually been. The sun barely peeked through the thick canopy, casting everything in a pale, ghostly light. And then, in the center of the clearing, we saw it. A large, gnarled tree stood at the far end of the space, its roots twisting out of the ground like fingers reaching for the sky. At the base of the tree, buried partially in the dirt, was something that made my blood run cold. It was a bone. A human bone. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over my own feet as I stared at the grim discovery. The others gathered around, their faces pale as they took in the sight. The bone was long and thin, looking almost fragile despite its size. It had been buried deep enough to be partially covered by dirt, but it was unmistakable. This wasn't some animal remains, it was human. "We need to get out of here," Olivia said in a trembling voice, her eyes wide with fear. "This is bad. This is so bad." But before we could even think about leaving, I heard something. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible, a soft rustling, as though the air itself was shifting. The trees around the clearing began to sway, their branches creaking under some unseen pressure. I turned toward the sound, but there was nothing there, nothing but the oppressive silence and the faint, rhythmic noise that seemed to vibrate through the air. And then I saw it, a shadow moving between the trees. It was fleeting, like a trick of the light, but I knew what I had seen. The figure was tall, thin, and as it moved, it seemed to blur in and out of focus, as though it wasn't fully part of this world. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the spot where I had seen the shadow. It didn't make sense. There was no one else here. We were deep in the woods, miles away from civilization. "What the hell is that?" Ben whispered, his voice barely audible. I don't know," I said, my throat dry. "But we need to go. Now." We turned and started running, the sounds of the forest closing in behind us. The branches cracked as something or someone followed us, just beyond our line of sight. I couldn't bring myself to look back. Every instinct told me to keep moving forward, to escape whatever it was that was chasing us through the woods. We didn't stop until we were back at the campsite, breathless and terrified. The forest had swallowed us up, and the strange sensation of being hunted had only grown stronger. But even as we huddled around the fire, trying to calm ourselves, the unsettling sense that we weren't alone lingered. The woods had changed overnight, and whatever was out there, it was getting closer. As the fire crackled and popped, casting eerie shadows across the campsite, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. The sense of unease that had followed us through the forest was now at the edge of our camp, lurking just beyond the firelight. The trees seemed to press in closer than before, the wind whipping through the branches with a low, mournful howl. None of us spoke. We sat huddled around the dying fire, our eyes darting nervously from the dark edges of the clearing to each other, as if expecting one of us to suggest leaving. But no one spoke the words. No one even moved, except for the occasional glance to check that the others were still there, still breathing. I could feel the weight of the silence pressing in on me, like the air had thickened, becoming almost unbearable. I wanted to get up, to go look around the camp, to make sure we were still alone, but something deep inside held me back. I knew that if I got up, if I moved away from the others, I might not be able to come back. The fire flickered one last time before it finally began to dwindle, the last of the embers glowing softly in the growing darkness. I shifted uneasily, my eyes still fixed on the surrounding woods, unable to tear myself away from the place where I thought I had seen that shadow earlier. And then it happened. The first scream sliced through the night, sharp and filled with terror. I leapt to my feet, my heart skipping a beat as I spun around, trying to locate the source. The scream was followed by another, this time a desperate, panicked cry that made my blood run cold. "Olivia!" Ethan shouted, his voice breaking with fear. I didn't need to be told twice. I was already running toward the source of the screams, my feet barely touching the ground as I pushed through the underbrush. The others were close behind, their footfalls heavy in the silence. But the closer we got, the more I felt the air shift. It was like a pressure had settled over everything, choking the life out of the woods. I reached the edge of the trees, my breath coming in shallow gasps, and froze. There, standing just beyond the firelight, was Olivia. She was staring at something in front of her, her eyes wide with terror. Her mouth moved, but no sound came out. She was paralyzed, her body trembling uncontrollably, as if her mind had completely shut down. I wanted to scream her name, to rush forward and pull her away from whatever had a hold on her, but my body wouldn't move. I couldn't tear my eyes away from what she was staring at. A figure stood before her, cloaked in the shadows. It was tall, impossibly tall, its limbs stretched unnaturally long. The skin of its face was pale, almost sickly, and its eyes glowed with a dull, unnatural light. It was staring at Olivia with an expression I couldn't read, its lips curling into something that might have been a smile or a snarl. For a split second, everything went completely still. The air was thick, heavy, as if the world itself was holding its breath. And then, without warning, the figure reached out toward Olivia. I could hear her sharp intake of breath, the sound of her skin brushing against the figure's cold touch. Her eyes went wide, and she stumbled back, the terror in her expression palpable. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know if I could help her. "Olivia, run!" I shouted, my voice cracking, but it was too late. The figure's hand shot out, grabbing Olivia by the wrist, its grip unyielding. She let out another scream, louder this time, more desperate, but it was drowned out by the deep, resonant hum that filled the air around us. The sound was so intense that it seemed to vibrate in my chest, making the world around us shimmer in a strange, disorienting way. In that moment, everything seemed to warp, as though reality itself was bending, twisting into something foreign. The trees around us began to sway unnaturally, the ground beneath our feet shuddering as if something enormous was moving just beneath the surface. The fire flickered and went out completely, plunging us into complete darkness. I could hear the others behind me, scrambling toward us, but it felt like the world had become thick with something oppressive. The air smelled metallic, like blood and rust. I could feel my pulse pounding in my throat, the overwhelming sense of dread making it hard to breathe. I reached out, my hand trembling as I tried to grab Olivia's arm to pull her away from the creature's grasp, but my fingers brushed against nothing. She was gone. Panic surged through me as I spun in place, trying to make sense of what had just happened. "Olivia?" I shouted into the darkness, my voice barely audible, but there was no answer. I could hear the others calling her name too, their voices frantic. I wasn't sure if it was the fear that made everything feel unreal, but the forest around us seemed to be closing in, the shadows growing longer and more sinister with each passing second. It felt as if the very woods themselves were shifting, moving around us. I turned back to the dark, empty space where Olivia had been standing. The creature, whatever it was gone, leaving only the faintest trace of its presence. The ground was disturbed where it had stood, but there was no sign of Olivia, no trace of her at all. It was like she had vanished. For a few long moments, none of us said anything. We just stood there, paralyzed by the terror of what we had just witnessed. It was as if the world had shifted, and the rules that we had known no longer applied. Whatever was in those woods, it wasn't something we could understand. It wasn't something we could fight. We have to leave," Ethan said finally, his voice shaking. I looked around, trying to gather my thoughts. The forest around us seemed to hum with an unnatural energy, the shadows stretching toward us like grasping hands. But there was no question about it, we had to leave. Whatever had taken Olivia wasn't something we could face, not with the knowledge we had now. "Let's go," I said, my voice trembling with fear. "We need to get out of here now." But as we turned to flee, I heard something behind me. It was faint at first, but then it grew louder, a sound that was unmistakable. Olivia's voice. She was calling out, whispering my name in the darkness, her voice full of fear and confusion. I froze, my heart leaping in my chest. The others stopped too, looking around, listening for her voice. It was coming from deeper in the woods. It sounded just like her, but there was something wrong about it, something off, like she was no longer herself. "Don't listen to it," Ben whispered urgently. "It's not her. It's trying to trick us." But the voice was insistent, growing louder with every passing second. And despite the fear that clenched my chest, I couldn't help myself. I started to move toward it, my legs moving almost against my will, drawn by the desperate sound of Olivia's call. And that's when I saw her. She was standing there, just beyond the tree line, her face pale and distorted, her body rigid in a way that wasn't natural. Her eyes were wide, but there was nothing human in them, nothing but a vacant, hollow stare. Her mouth was open, but no sound came from it. The creature had taken her, twisted her, and now it was using her voice to lure us in. And before I could react, before I could scream out a warning, the figure appeared once more. This time, it was not just a shadow. It was solid, tangible, and it was coming toward us, its hands outstretched. It was time to run. We ran. There was no other choice. The air was thick with panic, our hearts hammering in our chests as we sprinted through the dark forest, the sounds of the night closing in behind us. The voice, the twisted, hollow imitation of Olivia's cry, echoed in my mind, a haunting reminder of how powerless we were, how we had no way of stopping what was happening. The trees blurred around us as we tore through the underbrush, our feet stumbling over roots and rocks, the dense forest swallowing us whole. I didn't know how long we ran. Minutes, maybe hours. The time didn't seem to matter anymore. What mattered was putting as much distance between ourselves and that thing, the thing that had taken Olivia, the thing that had twisted her into something unrecognizable. Every rustle of leaves, Every snap of a twig underfoot made me freeze, my breath catching in my throat as I half expected it to be right behind us. But there was no pursuit. The creature didn't follow us. It was as if the forest itself had swallowed it whole, and all we had to do was keep running. At some point, we reached the edge of the woods, just a line of trees, marking the boundary between the wild and the world we knew. But when I stepped out into the open, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't truly safe. The night sky above us was eerily still, and the moon was hidden behind clouds, casting the world in an unnerving gray. The air was cold, the kind of cold that sunk deep into your bones. We collapsed into a heap, gasping for air, our bodies trembling with exhaustion and terror. Ethan, Ben, and I were all there, but there was no sign of Olivia. No sign of her at all. "Where is she?" I asked, my voice cracking, barely able to form the words. The silence around us felt suffocating, the world suddenly empty without her. Ben's face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. "I don't know," he said, his voice hoarse. She was right there. How did she just disappear? Did you hear her voice?" Ethan asked, his hands shaking as he wiped sweat from his forehead. She was calling out for us. I swear it was her." I nodded, my chest tight with dread. It sounded like her, but it wasn't. That thing was using her voice to trick us. "We should have gone back," Ben said, his words filled with regret and fear. "We should have tried to fight it. We should have." "There was nothing we could do," I interrupted, my voice shaking. "Nothing. We saw it. We saw what it did to her." The thought of Olivia, her eyes empty, her body stiff, the way she had stood there like a puppet, sent a cold shiver down my spine. I could still hear her voice, faint and distorted, echoing in my mind. No matter how much I tried to shake it off, the image of her twisted form would not leave me. "We can't go back," I said quietly. "We have to leave. Now." Ethan nodded, his face pale but resolute. "We don't know what that thing is or how it works. We don't know what happened to Olivia. But we can't risk it. We have to get out of here before it comes for us." With no other plan in mind, we turned away from the woods and started walking. We didn't know where we were going, hell. We didn't even know where we were. But all I could think about was getting as far away from that cursed place as possible. The deeper we walked into the unknown, the more I felt the weight of what had happened settle on me. We had escaped, yes, but at what cost? As we made our way through the darkened landscape, I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see that thing looming in the distance. The winds howled through the trees, the only sound that kept us company, but I could swear I heard something else, something faint, like footsteps. But each time I spun around, there was nothing there. We didn't stop walking until the first rays of sunlight broke through the horizon. By then, we had covered miles, the exhaustion in our bodies overwhelming. The strange, unnatural weight that had hung over us was beginning to lift, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we hadn't truly escaped. That thing, whatever it was still out there, still watching, waiting. When we finally reached a road, we stopped. We sat down by the side, panting and trying to catch our breath. We were miles from the campsite, far enough that I thought we might be safe. But even then, I knew we could never go back. That place, that cursed spot in the woods, was forever burned into my memory. Olivia was gone, and we couldn't even begin to understand what had happened to her. "We need to tell someone," Ben said quietly, his voice distant. "Who would believe us?" I replied, my throat dry. Who could possibly believe what we saw? Ethan stared at the road ahead, his eyes blank, as if lost in thought. "I don't know," he said after a long pause. "But we can't let her be forgotten. We can't let this thing go on." I nodded, but deep down, I knew the truth. The truth was that we were powerless. We had no answers. We didn't understand what had taken Olivia, what had turned her into something else. All we had were fragments, pieces of a nightmare that we couldn't explain. And that's what terrified me the most. We didn't know what that thing was or what it wanted. We didn't know how it worked or why it had chosen Olivia. All we had were questions unanswered, unanswerable questions. The police didn't believe us when we tried to explain what had happened. Of course, they didn't. How could they? No one would ever believe a story like ours. No one could. It was too strange, too unbelievable. We didn't even have proof, just a few scattered belongings, a torn-up journal, and a memory of something that shouldn't exist. Olivia's family never got closure. Her disappearance remained a mystery, unsolved and forgotten by most. There were no further investigations, no real answers. The woods that had claimed her were left untouched, abandoned by the authorities, left to fester in its own secrets. But every time I close my eyes, I can still hear her voice, faint, distorted, echoing through the darkness. I don't know what happened that night. I don't know what that thing was, or why it took Olivia. But I do know this. Whatever we encountered in those woods, it's still out there. And as long as it's out there, no one is safe. The tension that had gripped us all shattered into a frenzy of panic movement as we turned and bolted through the trees, our breath coming in ragged gasps. I couldn't stop to think, couldn't stop to ask why Olivia had vanished or how the creature had returned. The only thought that ran through my mind was to escape, to get as far away from that thing as possible. Branches lashed against my face, and the cold night air stung my lungs with each frantic breath. The sounds of footsteps behind me were muffled by the pounding of my heart, but I could feel the presence of the others, equally desperate to put distance between ourselves and the darkness closing in around us. The eerie hum that had filled the air before was gone, but the feeling of being hunted, of being watched, remained. We ran until we couldn't run anymore. Our legs burned, our bodies were exhausted, but there was no slowing down. The fear of what was following us, of what had taken Olivia, was enough to keep our legs moving. Finally, we stumbled into a clearing far from the campsite, and for the first time in hours, we dared to stop. I leaned against a tree, gasping for air, my mind spinning. Ethan, Ben, and the others collapsed next to me, their faces pale and drawn. No one spoke at first. We just sat in silence, trying to gather ourselves. What happened? Ben asked, his voice trembling. I shook my head, not sure how to explain what had happened. Olivia had vanished, her voice luring us deeper into the woods, only to be replaced by that thing, whatever it was. And now she was gone, swallowed by the darkness. We need to get back to the truck, Ethan said, his voice low. We need to leave. Right now. We all nodded. There were no arguments, no attempts to piece together the pieces of the nightmare we had just lived through. We just needed to get out of there. We started moving again, this time at a slower pace, though still wary of every crackling twig and rustling leaf. The air felt heavy, as if the woods themselves were still holding their breath, waiting for us to make another mistake. The silence was oppressive, like the forest was watching us. Hours passed, and it felt like the world had shifted, turned upside down. The further we went, the more I felt as if we were moving through a place that didn't belong to us anymore. The trees were twisted, the shadows thicker than they should have been. The road we had driven down earlier seemed impossibly far away. No matter how far we walked, it felt as though the darkness was creeping in from all sides. When we finally reached the truck, it was a relief, though it felt like a hollow one. There was no comfort in returning to the world we knew. Not after everything we had witnessed. Not after Olivia was taken. None of us spoke as we piled into the truck, the engine rumbling to life under my shaking hands. I could still hear Olivia's voice, still hear the desperate call she had made in the darkness. The memory of her face, the one twisted by fear, hollowed out by that thing, haunted me. It would haunt all of us for the rest of our lives. The drive back was silent, save for the hum of the engine and the occasional muttered curse. Every so often, I would glance at the others, but no one met my eyes. It was as if we were all afraid of what the other was thinking, but none of us could shake the feeling that we hadn't truly escaped. The woods still felt too close, too full of something that was waiting to make its return. We drove for hours, never once slowing down until we reached the edge of the town. It was only when we crossed into the familiar, light-polluted streets that a small sense of relief finally settled over me. We were safe, or at least I thought we were. But the truth was, we had left something behind, something dark, something that wouldn't stay in the forest. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the events over and over in my mind, searching for something, some detail that could explain what we had witnessed. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that there was no explanation. What had happened, what we had seen, was beyond understanding. And even though we were miles away from that place, from the woods, I couldn't shake the feeling that it hadn't ended, that it never would. Days passed after that night. Life went on, but for me, it would never be the same. The images of Olivia's face, her voice, everything about that night kept me up at night. I found myself staring at the trees outside my window, half expecting to see that tall, twisted figure standing there, watching me, waiting for the right moment to strike again. I tried to move on, tried to pretend like everything was fine, but the truth kept gnawing at me. The others seemed to be coping, or at least trying to, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we had been marked, that something had changed within us, something that wouldn't let us rest. I tried to contact Olivia's family, tried to tell them what happened, but every time I opened my mouth, the words wouldn't come. How could I explain that their daughter was gone, taken by something that couldn't be described, by something that didn't belong in this world? How could I tell them that she had vanished without a trace, and we had no answers, no closure? The police didn't help. They did their best, of course, conducting searches in the area, but they never found anything. No signs of struggle, no evidence, no footprints. It was like Olivia had just disappeared into thin air. I couldn't let it go, though. I couldn't just walk away from the truth, from what had happened to her. I started researching, diving into local legends, ancient stories of creatures in the woods, of things that preyed on the living. But nothing I found could explain what we had seen that night. Nothing could explain the creature, the way it seemed to bend reality around it. I don't know why, but I went back to the forest. Maybe it was to find Olivia's body, or maybe it was to confront whatever we had encountered, but I needed to go back. I had to. The forest was exactly as it had been before dark, oppressive and silent. As I walked through the trees, I felt a chill creep down my spine. I kept expecting to see something move in the shadows, or hear the whispers of that thing's voice calling me into the dark, but there was nothing. Nothing but the wind and the trees. Maybe I was finally free of it. Maybe whatever had been watching us was gone, but deep down, I knew it wasn't over. It had only just begun, and no matter how far I ran, no matter how far I went, it would always be there, waiting. The story I'm about to share happened in a setting so familiar to me that, even now, the memory leaves me restless. It's about an ordinary office building, the kind you pass on your way to work without giving a second thought. For me, though, it became the backdrop to nights I'll never forget. I worked in a mid-sized corporate office located in the heart of downtown. The building was old but functional, with its mix of creaky wooden floors and modernized conference rooms. I was an analyst, spending long hours poring over spreadsheets and reports that seemed to blur together under the harsh glow of fluorescent lights. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills. The office had a certain charm during the day, a steady hum of conversation, the distant ringing of phones, the smell of coffee brewing in the break room. But when the clock hit 6, the atmosphere shifted. Most employees left promptly, eager to escape into the fresh evening air. Only a handful of us lingered behind, either by choice or necessity. For me, it was necessity. Deadlines didn't care about the clock, and I often found myself working well past sunset. I wasn't alone in my late-night habits. There was Mark, the IT guy, who seemed to survive on energy drinks and a questionable diet of vending machine snacks. Then there was Rachel from accounting, a quiet, no-nonsense woman who rarely spoke but always nodded politely in passing. Sometimes the janitor, an older man named Victor, would make his rounds with his cart full of supplies, humming old tunes as he worked. The building itself was a relic of the 1970s, a sturdy 12-story structure with a facade of faded brick and narrow windows. The elevator, however, was an enigma. It was an old Otis model with polished brass buttons and a distinctly retro charm. It hummed softly when idle, almost like it was breathing. I never thought much about it, other than its habit of being temperamental. It wasn't uncommon for it to groan or jerk slightly between floors, but most of us chalked it up to its age. By day, the building bustled with life. By night, it felt like a different world. The long, narrow hallways were eerily quiet, the kind of silence that made you hyper-aware of your own footsteps. The fluorescent lights flickered more often than they should, casting strange shadows that played tricks on tired eyes. The vending machines buzzed softly, their mechanical hums breaking the stillness. My nights were a routine. I'd grab a sandwich or coffee from the cafe downstairs before it closed, settle into my cubicle, and work until the reports balanced or my eyes couldn't take it anymore. At some point, I'd hear Victor's cart squeak down the hallway, his voice faintly humming a song I couldn't place. Around 10 or 11, the floor would grow so quiet I could hear my own breathing. It was oddly peaceful in a way until it wasn't. On one particular Friday, I stayed late to finish an urgent project. The office felt emptier than usual, the silence heavier. Mark had left early to catch a concert, and Rachel hadn't been in all day. It was just me and the occasional sound of Victor's broom brushing against the tiled floors. At least, that's what I thought at the time. That night marked the beginning of something I still struggle to explain. It was subtle at first, just enough to make me question whether I was imagining things. But as the weeks went on, the strange occurrences escalated, and the elevator, a mundane machine I'd never paid much attention to, became the focal point of my growing unease. It started with a sound. Not a dramatic crash or a piercing scream, but something quieter, almost too faint to notice unless you were alone in a near-silent office late at night. That Friday, around 9:30 p.m., I was deep into reviewing quarterly data. My desk lamp cast a warm glow over the papers scattered across my desk, a stark contrast to the cold, bluish light of the overhead fluorescents. Outside my cubicle, the office was silent except for the faint hum of the air conditioning. That's when I heard it. A soft, distant ding from the elevator. It was odd, but not alarming, at least, not yet. People rarely use the elevator at this hour. Most of my coworkers had already left for the weekend, and Victor typically stuck to the first few floors until his rounds brought him up here later in the evening. I figured it might be him moving supplies, or maybe a latecomer from another department. Either way, I ignored it and returned my focus to the spreadsheet in front of me. A few minutes later, the ding sounded again. This time, it was followed by the faint creak of the elevator doors opening, then closing. My fingers paused on the keyboard. It wasn't unusual for the elevator to stop, but twice in such a short span, and at this hour. I leaned back in my chair, stretching my arms, and decided to investigate. Maybe Victor needed help. Stepping out of my cubicle, the quiet of the office wrapped around me like a thick blanket. The overhead lights flickered slightly, their faint buzz now more noticeable without the usual office chatter. As I walked toward the elevator, I called out, "Victor, that you?" My voice echoed down the empty hallway, but there was no response. The elevator was parked on my floor, its doors closed. I stood there for a moment, staring at the glowing number 7 above the door. Nothing about it seemed unusual. I reached out and pressed the button to call the elevator, expecting it to open immediately. It didn't. The light on the button lit up, but the door stayed firmly shut. I pressed it again. Still nothing. Now I was starting to feel uneasy. I glanced around the hallway, half expecting Victor to round the corner with his cart, but the corridor stretched empty in both directions. Deciding it wasn't worth dwelling on, I returned to my desk. Maybe the elevator was just being finicky, a quirk we all knew too well. About 20 minutes later, the ding came again. This time, I didn't ignore it. I stood up quickly and walked straight to the hallway, arriving just in time to hear the soft swish of the doors closing. No one stepped out. The light above the elevator now showed 5. My floor was 7, and to my knowledge, there was no one working 2 floors below me at this hour. Gripping my phone tightly, I considered calling Victor, but I didn't have his number. Instead, I decided to take the stairs down to the 5th floor. My curiosity had started to morph into a strange mix of annoyance and apprehension. Maybe someone was playing a prank. Or worse, maybe someone wasn't supposed to be here at all. The stairwell was dimly lit, its concrete walls echoing every step I took. By the time I reached the 5th floor, my heartbeat had quickened, though I couldn't say why. I pushed open the heavy metal door and stepped into the hallway. The floor was empty, desks neat, lights dimmed, computers off. It looked the way it always did after hours. The elevator stood at the end of the hallway, its brass buttons glowing faintly in the dim light. I approached it cautiously, half expecting the doors to open and reveal something or someone. They didn't. The elevator just sat there, silent and unassuming. I pressed the button to open the doors. This time, they complied. Inside, the elevator looked perfectly normal. The usual scuff marks on the floor, the faint graffiti etched into the stainless steel panels, the slightly worn buttons. Nothing was out of place. I stepped in and scanned the buttons. The last floor visited was indeed 7, but now the panels showed it was idle on 5. I pressed the 7 button and let the elevator take me back to my floor. As it ascended, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. When the doors opened, I stepped out quickly and returned to my desk, trying to focus on my work, but the ding came again. This time, the sound sent a chill down my spine. It wasn't just the noise, it was the timing. The elevator had stopped on my floor again, mere moments after I'd exited. I turned to look, and sure enough, the doors were closing, as if someone had just stepped inside. My stomach tightened. Okay, this is ridiculous, I muttered under my breath. I grabbed my phone and decided to text Mark. Maybe he'd know if there was some issue with the building systems. His reply was quick, but unhelpful. Dude, I'm at the concert. No idea what's going on there. I put my phone down, frustrated and a little embarrassed. I decided to chalk it up to a technical glitch and push through the last of my work. By the time I finally shut down my computer, it was nearly midnight. As I packed up my things, I made a point to avoid looking toward the elevator. But as I walked to the stairwell, I heard it again, the ding, this time accompanied by a faint but unmistakable creak, like someone shifting their weight inside the elevator. My pace quickened as I descended the stairs. I didn't stop until I was outside, breathing in the cool night air. I told myself I was being paranoid, that it was just an old elevator acting up. But even as I walked to my car, the sound lingered in my mind, each ding replaying like an unanswered question. The following week, I tried to put the strange elevator incidents out of my mind. It wasn't hard during the day when the office bustled with life. Phones ringing, keyboards clicking, and coworkers chatting about weekend plans. But when night fell and the office emptied, the uneasiness crept back in like an unwelcome visitor. It started small, so small, I almost convinced myself it wasn't happening. The elevator would stop on random floors, just as before, and I'd hear that same soft ding. But now, there were additional sounds. Faint footsteps in the hallway, or the muted shuffle of movement just beyond my line of sight. Every time I stepped out to check, there was nothing. The air felt heavier at night, the hum of the overhead lights, louder and more oppressive. One Tuesday evening, I decided to stay late again. The day had been chaotic, and I needed the quiet to focus. Around 10 p.m., I was staring at a spreadsheet when I heard it. The elevator dinged on my floor. I froze for a moment, listening intently. The sound of the doors opening echoed faintly down the hallway. Then silence. I waited, half expecting Victor, or maybe a coworker who'd lost track of time to walk past. But no one appeared. I stood up, the chair creaking under me, and slowly made my way to the hallway. My footsteps felt unnaturally loud against the carpeted floor. The elevator doors were closed. The panel above showing it had moved to 3. It struck me then that the stops weren't random. I pulled up the building's floor plan on my computer and started jotting down the times and floors the elevator had stopped. Over the past week, it had consistently visited floors 3, 5, and 7, always in that order. There was no clear reason for it, but the pattern made the incidents feel less like a glitch and more intentional. Curiosity got the better of me. The next night, I stayed late again, determined to figure out what was happening. This time, I brought a small notebook and a flashlight, a silly precaution that felt reassuring nonetheless. At 9:42 p.m., the first ding came, just as I predicted. The elevator stopped on the 3rd floor. I waited, my heart pounding, before stepping into the stairwell and descending as quietly as I could. The 3rd floor was dimly lit, the motion-activated lights flickering to life as I stepped out. It looked just as it always did, rows of cubicles, a small kitchenette, and empty desks. I walked toward the elevator, gripping the flashlight tightly. The panel showed it was now idle on the 5th floor. My breath quickened as I headed back to the stairwell. By the time I reached the 5th floor, I was drenched in sweat despite the cool air conditioning. This floor was darker, with only a few emergency lights casting long shadows across the walls. The elevator doors were open. For a moment, I thought I saw something in a faint outline of a figure standing inside, but when I blinked, it was gone. I stepped closer, shining the flashlight inside. The elevator was empty, just as it had been before. I pressed the button to call it back to my floor and watched as the doors closed and the elevator began to ascend. The air in the office started to feel different after that night. It was subtle at first, a slight chill that seemed out of place in the normally climate-controlled building. The faint hum of the lights seemed louder, almost like a low-frequency vibration you could feel in your chest. Even the shadows cast by the fluorescent bulbs seemed sharper, more defined. Coworkers began mentioning odd things, too. Anna from accounting told me she'd heard someone walking behind her in the hallway one evening, but when she turned around, no one was there. Paul, our IT guy, said the elevator had stopped on his floor twice in 1 hour while he was working late. He'd assumed it was just me until I told him I'd been at home that night. It wasn't just the elevator anymore. Files went missing from desks, only to reappear in odd places like the break room or the printer tray on a completely different floor. The coffee machine would start brewing on its own, filling the air with the rich scent of coffee at odd hours. Victor mentioned that his cleaning supplies had been moved overnight, though he was the only one with access to the storage closet. One evening, as I combed through old building records online, I stumbled upon a detail that made my blood run cold. The office building had been constructed in the late 1980s and had undergone several renovations over the years. During one of these renovations in the early 2000s, a worker had reportedly died in an elevator shaft accident. His name was never publicly released, but the records described a freak incident involving a malfunctioning lift. I couldn't help but connect the dots. Could the strange occurrences be linked to that accident? It felt far-fetched, but nothing else made sense. I shared what I'd found with Paul, who shrugged it off as a coincidence. Old buildings always have stories like that, he said, but I could tell he was just as uneasy as I was. The breaking point came 2 nights later. It was nearly midnight, and I was wrapping up my work when the elevator dinged again. This time, it didn't stop at just one floor. It moved systematically, stopping at every single floor in the building, one after the other. The sound was relentless. Ding, pause, doors open, close, move. I watched the panel from my desk, my heart pounding as the numbers climbed steadily toward my floor. When it finally stopped on 7, I stood frozen, unsure of what to do. The air around me felt electrified, like the moments before a thunderstorm. Slowly, I walked to the hallway, my footsteps echoing in the oppressive silence. The elevator doors were open, but the cab was empty. I stepped closer, peering inside. The interior lights flickered, casting distorted reflections on the stainless steel walls. For a moment, I thought I heard breathing slow, shallow breaths coming from somewhere inside. My chest tightened, and I stumbled back, my flashlight slipping from my hand and clattering to the floor. The doors closed abruptly, almost angrily, and the elevator descended. This time, I didn't follow it. Instead, I grabbed my bag, locked up the office, and left without looking back. As I walked to my car, the chill in the air seemed to follow me, an invisible presence pressing against my back. Over the next few days, the tension in the office became unbearable. Everyone seemed on edge, whispering about the strange events, but avoiding any direct acknowledgement. The elevator continued its nightly ritual, and I found myself dreading the evenings more and more. The once familiar space of my workplace now felt foreign, hostile, and alive in a way that defied explanation. I knew I couldn't ignore it any longer. Whatever was happening wasn't going to stop on its own, and deep down, I feared that the elevator wasn't just malfunctioning, it was calling, and it wanted someone to answer. It was a Friday night when everything came to a head. The office was emptier than usual, most employees having left early to enjoy their weekend. I'd promised myself I wouldn't stay late again, but deadlines had a way of overruling fear. By 9 p.m., the quiet had settled in, thick and oppressive. Even the distant hum of the city outside seemed muted, as if the world was holding its breath. I sat at my desk, my screen glowing softly, the faint clatter of my keyboard the only sound in the room. But that fragile normalcy didn't last long. At precisely 9:23 p.m., the first thing came. I froze mid-typing, my eyes darting to the digital clock on my monitor. Right on schedule. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself that it was just another random stop. But then it happened again. And again. Each ding sent a spike of adrenaline through me. The elevator was moving systematically through the building, stopping on each floor. By the time it reached the 5th floor, I couldn't concentrate anymore. My breathing was shallow, my hands clammy. I stared at the panel above my floor's elevator, waiting for the inevitable. Ding. It stopped on 7. The doors opened, and this time, the sound was louder, sharper as if it had been amplified. I grabbed my flashlight and stood up, the chair groaning loudly in the silence. My legs felt heavy, reluctant to move, but I forced myself toward the hallway. The doors were open, the elevator cab bathed in flickering light. It was empty, or so I thought. As I stood there, staring into its depths, something shifted. It wasn't a sound or a sight, but a feeling, a sudden, oppressive weight that pressed against my chest. My ears filled with a low, resonating hum, like a faraway engine revving. Before I could react, the doors began to close. I don't know what compelled me, but I stepped forward and placed my hand on the edge, forcing them open. The elevator felt colder than it should, the air inside unnaturally chilled. My breath fogged as I stepped inside. The doors slid shut behind me with an almost finality, and the elevator lurched into motion. The panel showed we were descending, but there was no destination floor lit up. It moved slowly, creaking as it went. I clutched my flashlight, the beam unsteady as I scanned the mirrored walls. My reflection stared back, pale and wide-eyed, but in the corner of the mirror, something didn't look right. At first, it was just a shadow, subtle, almost imperceptible. But then it moved. A dark, shapeless mass shifted in the corner of the elevator, too solid to be a trick of the light. My heart raced as I turned to look directly at it, but there was nothing there. When I glanced back at the mirror, the shadow was gone. The elevator came to a jarring stop, shaking slightly as it did. The panel showed a floor that didn't exist. B1. The building didn't have a basement. I pressed the open door button frantically, but nothing happened. The buttons wouldn't light up, the emergency phone was dead, and the air grew colder with every passing second. With a soft ding, the doors opened, revealing complete darkness beyond. My flashlight's beam barely penetrated the void, but what I could see made my stomach drop. The space beyond wasn't part of the office. The walls were rough, unfinished concrete, and the floor was strewn with debris, broken tiles, scraps of wood, and what looked unsettlingly like claw marks gouged into the surface. I didn't want to step out, but the elevator wasn't moving, and staying inside felt worse. I hesitated, my feet refusing to cross the threshold. Then I heard it, a faint, wet dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled across the floor. Hello? My voice echoed weakly, swallowed by the oppressive silence. The dragging stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. Then, from somewhere deep in the darkness, came a whisper, a low, guttural sound that sent a shiver down my spine. Why are you here? The voice was followed by a loud crash, and I stumbled backward into the elevator, the flashlight slipping from my grip and rolling to the edge of the doorway. It illuminated just enough to see a figure emerging from the darkness. It wasn't human, at least, not anymore. Its body was twisted and gaunt, its limbs unnaturally long, and its face was a hollow void, like a shadow made flesh. I scrambled to the control panel, slamming the close door button with shaking hands. The figure moved closer, its distorted form dragging itself toward me with impossible speed. Just as its hand, if you could call it, that reached the edge of the elevator, the doors finally slid shut. The elevator jolted upward, and I collapsed against the wall, gasping for air. The panel flickered, displaying random numbers before finally stopping on 7. When the doors opened, I didn't wait. I ran. The hallway was eerily silent, but something felt different. The lights flickered violently, casting erratic shadows across the walls. As I reached my desk to grab my belongings, I noticed the office wasn't empty anymore. Figures stood motionless in the cubicles, their faces turned toward me. They weren't my coworkers, at least, not as I remembered them. Their features were blurred, indistinct, as if I were looking at them through frosted glass. They didn't move, but their presence was suffocating. I backed away slowly, clutching my bag, until I bumped into something solid. Turning, I found myself face to face with Victor. Only, it wasn't Victor anymore. His eyes were vacant, his expression blank, and his mouth opened slightly, emitting a low, static-like sound. I bolted for the exit, the figures turning in unison to watch me go. The emergency stairwell was my only option. I ran down the stairs 2 at a time, the sound of footsteps echoing behind me, too many footsteps. I didn't dare look back. When I finally burst out into the parking lot, the cold night air hit me like a wave. I turned to look back at the building, half expecting to see it consumed by the horrors I'd just escaped. But it was normal, quiet. The windows glowed softly, and everything looked as it should. But I knew it wasn't over. As I fumbled with my car keys, I heard it again. The elevator dinged, faint but unmistakable, echoing through the empty lot. My hands shook as I started the engine and sped away, the sound of that haunting chime following me into the night. The fear stayed with me, a constant companion. The elevator hadn't just called me that night, it had shown me something I couldn't explain or forget. And deep down, I knew it wasn't finished with me. The days after that night felt like a blur. I couldn't escape the feeling that something was still out there, waiting for me. No matter where I went, I could feel eyes on me, lurking in the corners of my vision. Even in the safety of my apartment, the sounds of the office elevator, those maddening dings, echoed in my mind, twisting my sense of reality. I tried to convince myself that I was just shaken up, that it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew better. The events in the building weren't just some figment of imagination, they were real. And no matter how far I ran, I couldn't shake the feeling that the elevator and whatever had been in it was still following me. I knew I had to go back. There was no choice. The thought of returning to that office, the place that had now become a nightmare, filled me with dread. But I couldn't just walk away, not without answers. And I couldn't let whatever had happened in that building control me. I wasn't going to let that twisted elevator win. The next morning, I returned to the office. It was quiet, as it always had been in the early hours. The familiar hum of the fluorescent lights and the soft tapping of keyboards were comforting in their ordinariness. But everything felt off. The atmosphere was heavier, thicker, as if the air itself had absorbed the dark energy that had invaded the building. I walked through the hallways, my footsteps echoing louder than usual. The elevator was the first thing I needed to confront. There was no way around it. I had to face whatever it was that had haunted me, even if it meant confronting the deepest part of my fear. I stood in front of the elevator bank, staring at the shiny doors. They gleamed in the harsh fluorescent light, almost too perfect. There was no sign of the disturbance that had occurred days before. The floors were lit up. The elevator appeared normal, almost too normal. But I had learned something that night. Nothing was ever as it seemed. I took a deep breath and pressed the button. The elevator door slid open, and I stepped inside. The moment my feet crossed the threshold, I felt that familiar, unsettling pressure in my chest. The doors closed with an eerie finality, and I was once again alone in the confined space. But this time, it was different. I wasn't just waiting for it to happen. I was ready for it. The elevator moved, but it didn't stop at the first floor. Instead, it descended, slowly, deeper into the building. My heart raced, but I didn't let myself panic. I'd come prepared. I'd read everything I could about the building's history, its blueprints. There was no B1 floor, no basement, but that didn't matter. The elevator was going to take me somewhere else, somewhere, unseen. With each passing floor, the tension grew. I could feel the weight of whatever had been lurking in the darkness, waiting for me to return. But I was resolute. This time, I wouldn't be fooled. I wouldn't let fear control me. When the elevator finally stopped, it wasn't on any of the floors I recognized. The display showed nothing but the number B1, the same as before. The doors opened with a soft ding that sent a chill down my spine. The dark, unfinished basement from before awaited me. But this time, I wasn't afraid. I stepped out of the elevator, flashlight in hand, and walked toward the darkness. The air felt colder than it should be, but it was manageable. I didn't know what I was looking for, but I had to find something, anything that would explain what had happened. The sounds of my footsteps echoed off the concrete walls as I ventured deeper into the darkness. My flashlight flickered, casting long, distorted shadows. I felt the unmistakable presence of something watching me, but I refused to be intimidated. Suddenly, I heard it again, the dragging sound. It was unmistakable. Closer this time, moving with purpose. My breath hitched in my throat as I turned the corner, my flashlight sweeping over the room. There it was. The figure. It was still there, but it was different this time. More solid, more present than before. Its body was twisted, its limbs unnaturally long and jagged. But its face was alive, its hollow eyes now glowing with an unsettling light. The creature was no longer hidden in shadows. It had stepped into the light. For a moment, neither of us moved. I couldn't bring myself to speak. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, but nothing in my rational brain could explain it. This was something beyond human comprehension. Something from another world. Why are you still here? It rasped, its voice a low, crackling whisper that sent tremors through my body. I'm not leaving until I get answers, I replied, my voice sounding braver than I felt. The creature tilted its head, its movements jerky, unnatural. You can't leave. You're a part of this now. Before I could react, the ground beneath me shook and the walls trembled. The elevator had moved. It was back. The metallic doors slid open again, and I heard the unmistakable ding once more. But something was different this time. The creature's eyes flickered, and for the briefest of moments, I thought I saw fear in them. It turned and began to crawl toward the elevator, its limbs scraping against the concrete floor. I knew I had no time to waste. With the creature distracted, I bolted toward the elevator. My heart pounded in my chest as I slammed the button to close the doors, desperately hoping they would comply. The doors shut just in time, and the elevator lurched upward, away from the darkness below. When I reached the top floor, I ran out, barely glancing back. I didn't stop until I was out of the building, breathing in the cool night air. The familiar hum of the city outside made the horrors I had just experienced feel almost surreal, but I knew it was not over. The elevator was still there. The entity was still there, and somehow I knew it wouldn't let me go. I never returned to the office. I couldn't. I packed up my things and left, never once looking back. It felt like I had narrowly escaped something terrible, something that I couldn't quite understand, but knew, deep down, was beyond my ability to control. I moved to a new city, found a new job, and settled into a life of normalcy, or as close to normal as I could get. But that sound, the ding, that incessant, haunting ding, it still follows me. Sometimes, in the dead of night, when everything is quiet, I hear it again. The soft, metallic ding, as if the elevator is calling me back. I've tried to ignore it, but I can't shake the feeling that whatever I experienced that night, whatever that thing in the elevator was, is still out there, and it's still waiting for me. The sound still haunts me. I've done my best to move on, to forget the nightmare of that elevator, but every now and then, when I'm walking through a building with a quiet, still night creeping in, I hear it again. That soft ding, a sound so innocent yet so deeply unsettling. And it brings me back to that dark place, that suffocating basement, and the creature that lurked there. I've learned to live with it though. It's funny how quickly you can get used to fear, how you can convince yourself that something terrible is no longer a threat just by pretending it doesn't exist. But deep down, I know better. The elevator is still there, somewhere. That twisted, malevolent force isn't something that just disappears. Sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can still see the creature's glowing eyes staring at me. The way it moved, the unnatural twist of its limbs, it's like a memory that won't fade. I think back to that night, the moment I realized that I wasn't just dealing with a malfunctioning elevator. I had opened a door to something that shouldn't be. I often wonder if anyone else has experienced what I did. Has anyone else had the courage or the misfortune to confront the thing in the elevator? Or am I alone in carrying this knowledge, this weight? What if there are others out there, silently enduring the same haunting sound, waiting for their own encounter with the unknown? It's strange how a place that was once familiar, even comforting, can turn into a nightmare. I used to think of the office as just another part of my daily routine. It was my job, my life, a means to an end. Now, I'll never look at it the same way. The elevator, the building itself, will always be tainted by what I encountered. I wonder if the other employees ever felt that presence, that heaviness in the air, or if they just went about their lives, blissfully unaware. I've thought about telling someone, reaching out to someone who might understand. But every time I start to, something holds me back. How could I explain it? How could I make someone believe that the elevator was more than just a faulty machine, that it was alive, with something dark inside of it, waiting for its next victim? Maybe I'm just fooling myself, clutching at straws of sanity, trying to hold on to something normal. But I can't help but feel that I've crossed into something that can't be explained by logic or reason. I've felt it, I've seen it, I've experienced it, and I can never go back to the way things were before. For now, I try to live my life. I avoid elevators whenever I can. I stick to stairs, even when they're inconvenient, even when it means I have to climb 5 or 6 flights of stairs instead of pressing a button and letting the elevator do the work. I know it's irrational. I know it's not practical, but it's my way of keeping my distance, of not tempting fate. And yet, no matter where I go, no matter how many different places I live in or how far I travel, I still hear that sound sometimes. It's faint, almost drowned out by the noise of the world around me. But it's there. The elevator is waiting. It's been years since that night. I've moved on, or so I like to think. I've started a new life, with a new routine, new surroundings. And yet, when I least expect it, when I'm alone in the quiet darkness, I hear it. That soft ding. It's a sound that never leaves me a reminder that sometimes, no matter how hard we try to forget, the past never truly lets go. And every now and then, when I'm standing in front of an elevator, my hand hovering over the button, I wonder, what if I pressed it again? Would I go back to that place? Would I see the creature again? Or would I fall deeper into the nightmare, unable to escape? I'll never know. But I've learned one thing. Some doors, some elevators, are better left unopened. And no matter how much I wish it were over, part of me knows that the elevator, and whatever resides in it, is always waiting, always dinging, always ready for the next person to step inside. I just hope I'm never that person again. I've learned to live with the fear, to accept it as part of me, a shadow that follows no matter where I go. But deep down, I know I'll never be free of it. The elevator will always be there, and with it, the memories, the nightmares, the never-ending ding. I can only hope that one day it will stop. But until then, all I can do is listen. And remember, it was a summer weekend, the kind of time when people are craving an escape from the everyday grind, a break from the usual noise of the city, from the deadlines at work, and the never-ending to-do lists. We had been talking about it for months, planning every detail, looking at maps and scenic routes. The idea was simple, a road trip to get away from it all. I had always loved driving. The open road, the sound of the engine humming, and the sense of freedom that comes with each mile traveled. My friends, we all shared that sense of adventure, of course, but I was the one who took the lead. It was my car, my GPS, and my playlist that set the mood for the journey. As we packed up, it felt like we were just taking another routine trip out of the city, the sort that people take every weekend. Nothing special. Or so, I thought. There were 3 of us in the car. I was in the driver's seat, of course, because I was the one who knew the best routes, and honestly, I liked being in control of the journey. My buddy Sam was in the passenger seat, scrolling through his phone, while Mike sat in the back, occasionally joining in on the conversation, but mostly lost in his thoughts. The drive started as any road trip would: no rush, no urgency, just the freedom of the open highway and the warmth of the summer sun. We joked, we laughed, we listened to music, and we checked out the scenery. Everything about that day was as ordinary as it could get. We were leaving the city and heading towards a quieter, more peaceful place. I remember looking at the GPS, setting our destination to a small town up north, a place known for its untouched landscapes and scenic beauty. It was supposed to be the perfect escape. The trip had been planned months in advance, and now we were finally hitting the road. The first couple of hours passed without incident. The sun was setting in the distance, painting the sky with oranges and purples as we headed further into the rural countryside. I remember thinking how peaceful everything seemed, how the city was fading behind us, and we were getting closer to the kind of place that felt timeless. No noise, no traffic, just the sound of our car cruising along the winding roads. I had my hands on the wheel. Sam was still texting, and Mike was fiddling with the car's stereo, trying to find something that would fit the mood. We stopped once for a quick snack at a rest stop, stretching our legs and grabbing some water before getting back in the car. By this point, the sky had turned darker, and the lights of the city were far behind. We were in the thick of it now, surrounded by endless stretches of forest and fields. This was when it started. I had always trusted my GPS. After all, I had used it countless times for trips like this, and it had never failed me. But as we kept driving deeper into the countryside, I noticed that the usual direction started to feel off. At first, it was subtle. A few turns that seemed unnecessary, a couple of recalculations that didn't make sense. But as the minutes ticked by, it became more apparent that something wasn't quite right. We were no longer driving towards the small town I had set as our destination. The roads had become increasingly desolate, with fewer signs and no visible markers. The GPS was still showing that we were on the correct route, but it didn't make sense. The landscape around us was changing too. What had once been fields and forests turned into barren land, wide open spaces where there were no homes, no other cars, and no sign of life. I glanced over at Sam, who had finally stopped texting and was staring at the screen with a confused expression. Mike had noticed it too. We all knew something was wrong, but none of us said anything immediately. We just kept driving, the low hum of the engine filling the silence. It was around this time that the first odd thing happened. A strange, cold wind seemed to pick up out of nowhere, rattling the windows of the car. It was sudden, like a gust that wasn't tied to any weather pattern. Sam looked over at me, his brow furrowed. "What was that?" he asked, his voice low. "I don't know," I replied. "But it's weird." I tried to brush it off as nothing more than a gust of wind, maybe from an open window ahead of us, but there was something in the air that felt wrong. The further we drove, the more the atmosphere began to change. The air was heavy, and the once peaceful surroundings had now turned eerie. It was like we had driven into a completely different world, one that didn't make any sense. At this point, the road had narrowed, and the trees had grown so thick that they nearly covered the sky above us. The headlights of the car barely pierced through the darkness. I checked the GPS again, but it was just as baffling as before. According to the map, we were on the right road, but the road itself didn't look like anything on the map. "Where are we, exactly?" Mike asked from the back seat, his voice trembling. I looked at the screen one more time, hoping to find something familiar, but there was nothing. The GPS kept directing me down roads that seemed to appear out of nowhere, small, dirt paths that were barely wide enough for the car to fit through. It didn't make sense. Then, the next thing happened. We drove past a dilapidated old house, one that looked like it hadn't been lived in for decades. The windows were boarded up, and the front yard was overgrown with weeds. It was strange out of place in an area that was otherwise empty. It was the kind of house you'd see in a horror movie, the one that looked like it held dark secrets. I couldn't help but feel a chill run down my spine. Sam noticed it too. He looked over at me with wide eyes. "Did you see that?" he asked. "There's something off about that place." I nodded, trying to shake off the unease settling in my chest. But even as I did, I couldn't ignore the growing sense of dread that was creeping in. And then, just as we rounded another curve in the road, the GPS blinked. It was a simple message. Destination reached. We all looked at the screen, trying to make sense of it. There was nothing ahead of us but darkness, no town, no lights, just the eerie silence of the night. I slowed down, my heart pounding in my chest. Something was wrong. We had been led here, but I didn't know where here even was. We stopped the car in the middle of the road, unsure of what to do next. The air outside was cold, and there was no sign of life for miles. The GPS had shown that we had arrived, but the reality of the situation didn't match the technology's instructions. There was nothing in front of us but the endless stretch of empty road and the looming darkness of the trees on either side. The silence was suffocating, as if the world itself had pressed pause. I glanced over at Sam, who was staring out of the passenger window, his face pale. Mike, still sitting in the back seat, was eerily quiet. His usual banter was gone, replaced by a heavy tension in the air. No one said anything at first. It was as if we were all waiting for someone else to speak. as if somehow breaking the silence would make things more real. "What the hell just happened?" Sam muttered under his breath. I wasn't sure how to answer him. I had checked the GPS multiple times, but it was still showing that we were at our destination. It didn't make sense. We were supposed to be in a small, quiet town, but all I saw was an empty road, a house that looked abandoned, and a thick, unsettling fog starting to roll in. "I don't get it," I said, turning the ignition back on. "This isn't right. The GPS says we're here. But where's the town?" Mike shifted in his seat, his eyes wide. "Maybe the GPS is messed up. It happens sometimes, right?" I didn't reply. My mind was racing, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, something beyond just a faulty GPS. It felt too quiet, too empty. It wasn't the kind of place where people would live. In fact, the house we passed moments ago, the one that looked abandoned and decaying, had left a strange impression on me. There was no reason for a house like that to be there, in the middle of nowhere, and yet it was. And now, we had been led to a place that didn't exist on any map. "Let's just turn around," Sam suggested, his voice tense. "This place is giving me the creeps." I nodded, agreeing with him. The last thing I wanted to do was keep driving down this dark, isolated road. I checked the GPS again, hoping for some sort of direction, but the map had frozen. The screen showed a blip of our car in the middle of a blank space. No streets, no landmarks, just a vast, empty void. "Maybe we should call for help," Mike said, his voice shaky. "Like, maybe we're lost or something." That idea seemed sensible, but the more I thought about it, the less it felt like a simple mistake. Something was off about all of this. Why hadn't we seen anyone else on the road? Why was everything so eerily quiet? No other cars, no lights in the distance, no sign of life anywhere. "All right, I'll try to call," I said, fumbling with my phone. I held it up to the dashboard and waited for a signal, but nothing happened. The screen stayed blank, and the bars stayed at 0. "Great," I muttered, frustrated. "There's no signal here. We're completely cut off." I turned the car around, deciding to head back the way we came, hoping to retrace our steps and figure out where we went wrong. But when I hit the gas and turned the wheel, it felt like something was pulling us forward, like the road itself was pushing us deeper into the woods. Despite my efforts to turn around. "Stop!" Sam shouted suddenly, his hand gripping the dashboard. "Look!" I slammed on the brakes, causing the car to lurch forward and stop with a screech. For a moment, no one said anything. We were all staring out the window, frozen. There, just ahead of us, was the same dilapidated house we had passed earlier. But now it looked different, as if it had been pulled out of our memories and placed back in front of us in an even more sinister form. The windows, which had once been boarded up, were now cracked, and a faint light flickered from behind the broken panes. The front yard, which had been overgrown with weeds and vines, now appeared manicured, as though someone had been tending to it recently. The entire place had an unsettling, unnatural aura around it. It was as though the house was alive, watching us. "I swear to God, that wasn't there before," Mike whispered, his voice low and strained. "We passed it before, didn't we?" "I don't know," I said, my heart pounding in my chest. "But we're not stopping here." But before I could put the car in reverse, the engine sputtered and stalled. The lights went out, and the car fell silent, leaving us in complete darkness. The only sounds now were the distant rustling of the wind and our own breathing. I tried the engine again, but there was no response. I tried it once more, harder this time, but it still wouldn't start. Panic began to creep in as I fumbled with the ignition. "What the hell is happening?" Sam asked, his voice rising in alarm. "I don't know," I replied, my hands shaking. "I'm trying, all right. Just give me a second." But as I turned the key again, I felt a cold hand of dread wash over me. It wasn't just the car that felt wrong. The entire atmosphere had shifted. It was like a thick, invisible fog was pressing down on us, suffocating us with its weight. The air grew colder, and the trees around us seemed to loom in closer. The world outside felt wrong. There was a presence there, something unseen, but undeniably real. Sam leaned forward, looking through the windshield. "Do you see that?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. I followed his gaze, my blood running cold. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw a figure standing just at the edge of the tree line. It was a person, but it wasn't quite right. The figure was tall, too tall, with limbs that seemed unnaturally long. It didn't move, not even a twitch, just stood there in the darkness, watching us. I felt my heart skip a beat. What the hell? I couldn't tear my eyes away from the figure. It was as if it was daring me to look away, daring me to move. The seconds felt like hours, each one dragging on as we sat there, frozen in place. Guys, Mike said quietly, his voice trembling. I don't think we should be here. I don't think we're supposed to be here. But before any of us could react, the figure vanished. 1 second it was there, and the next it was gone, disappearing into the woods as if it had never been there at all. The car suddenly jolted to life with a loud engine roar, as if waking from a deep slumber. The lights flickered back on, and the engine hummed like it always had, but the unease remained. We were still in the middle of nowhere, and now we were more lost than ever. What just happened? Sam asked, his voice tight with fear. I don't know, I said, gripping the wheel with both hands, my knuckles white. But we need to get out of here. Now. But even as I said the words, I felt the weight of the situation press down on me. It wasn't just the broken car or the odd figure in the woods. There was something deeper, something that I couldn't explain. It was as if we were being drawn into something dark and unknown, a place where the rules of reality no longer applied. I put the car in gear and drove forward, eager to leave the scene behind. But the unsettling feeling never left. We hadn't even realized it yet, but we were already a part of something far beyond our understanding, and we were about to learn just how deep it went. We drove for what felt like hours, but the road stretched endlessly, never changing. The headlights cut through the dark, but the fog thickened with every mile. It clung to the car like a cold, suffocating blanket, obscuring our view of anything beyond the immediate path. I kept my eyes fixed on the road, hands gripping the wheel tighter than I ever had before. No one spoke. It was like we were all waiting for something to happen, something to break the silence, but it never came. The GPS, though still functional, was as useless as before. It offered no direction, no clues, just a blank, empty space. Each time I glanced at it, it seemed more and more like a cruel joke. The little blinking arrow that should have shown us the way just hovered, aimless and suspended in the middle of nowhere. I could feel the tension building, not just from the strangeness of the situation, but from the unease spreading between us. Sam was hunched over in the passenger seat, his eyes darting nervously to the trees as we passed, while Mike, in the back, had taken to checking the locks on the doors over and over again. Something's not right, Sam finally muttered, breaking the silence, his voice tinged with frustration. We've been driving for hours, and there's nothing here. No signs, no town, nothing. I glanced over at him, his face pale in the dim light. The tension in his voice matched the panic that was starting to grip me. I had never been this far from civilization before, but now I realized the emptiness around us wasn't just isolation. It was something more profound, something that made the air feel thick, oppressive. Maybe we should stop and look around, Mike suggested, his voice shaky. Check if there's anything nearby. We can't just keep driving aimlessly. I hesitated. Something in my gut told me that stopping would be a mistake, but the idea of continuing like this, not knowing where we were or where we were headed, was equally unsettling. The tension was unbearable. Reluctantly, I pulled over to the side of the road, the tires grinding against the gravel as the car came to a halt. The engine sputtered out, leaving us in complete silence once again. The fog hung around us like a veil, and the only sound was the occasional rustle of the trees swaying in the wind. It was a different kind of quiet than I had ever known before, like the world was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I'll go first, I said, unbuckling my seatbelt and stepping out of the car. The cold air hit me immediately, a sharp bite that cut through my jacket and made me shiver. The fog swirled around my feet, curling up like fingers, as though trying to drag me back toward the road. My boots crunched against the gravel as I walked a few steps, squinting into the mist. Stay close, I called back to the others, but my voice sounded strange in the stillness, like it didn't belong. Sam and Mike followed me, both of them looking around nervously. We moved cautiously, unsure of what we were searching for. There were no signs of life, no animals, no lights in the distance, not even the usual sounds of nature that you'd expect on an isolated road. Everything was dead silent, and I could feel the weight of that silence pressing down on us. "I don't like this," Sam said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It feels like we're not supposed to be here." I nodded, agreeing more than I cared to admit. But there was something else too, something deeper. A feeling that the air itself was thick, with a presence we couldn't see, but could somehow feel, like we were being watched. We moved further into the mist, our footsteps muffled by the fog. The trees around us seemed to close in, their twisted, gnarled branches reaching down like fingers trying to grab hold of us. I strained my eyes, trying to make sense of the shapes in the mist, but everything was distorted. I couldn't tell where the road ended and the forest began. Everything blended together, a haze of gray and black that made the world feel like it was closing in on us. "That house," Mike said suddenly, pointing toward a shape in the distance. I froze. There, barely visible through the fog, was the same house we had passed earlier, the one that had seemed so out of place, so wrong. But this time, it was different. It wasn't just the house anymore, it was the land surrounding it. The yard, once overgrown and wild, was now meticulously trimmed, with fresh flowers planted along the edges, as if someone had been working there recently. "How did it change?" Sam asked, his voice trembling with disbelief. I didn't know. There was no explanation for it. The house had been decaying when we saw it last, but now it looked pristine, like someone had been taking care of it, despite it clearly being abandoned. The windows were clear, the door ajar, as though inviting us in. A sudden movement in the window caught my eye. Someone was inside. I froze, unable to look away. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice shaky. There was no answer, but the curtains fluttered slightly, as if someone or something was watching us from the inside. We all stood there in silence, the tension hanging in the air like a thundercloud ready to burst. "Let's get back to the car," I said, my voice tight with fear. "Now!" I didn't wait for a response. I turned on my heel and started walking back toward the road, but something stopped me, something I couldn't explain. I felt the urge to turn around, to look back at the house one last time, even though every instinct told me not to. But when I did, I saw something that made my blood run cold. In the window, the figure I had seen earlier was now standing directly behind the glass, staring out at us. It was the same tall, unnaturally thin figure, its face obscured by the shadows, but its presence was unmistakable. It wasn't just watching us, it was waiting. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't obey. My feet were frozen to the ground, and all I could do was stare at the figure in the window. "Guys, we need to go. Now!" I finally managed to shout, my voice hoarse with panic. We ran back to the car, fear pushing us forward. When we reached the vehicle, I didn't waste any time getting in. I slammed the door shut, locking it immediately, as if that would somehow protect us from whatever was out there. Sam and Mike followed suit, and within seconds, I had the engine roaring to life. But just as I was about to pull away, I caught a glimpse of something in the rearview mirror. The house was gone. There was nothing but an empty stretch of road behind us, the trees standing still in the fog. The house that had been there just moments ago had vanished, as if it had never existed at all. My heart was pounding in my chest as I floored the accelerator, tearing down the road as fast as I could. The tension in the car was unbearable, but there was one thing I knew for sure. Whatever was happening out here, whatever we had stumbled into, it wasn't over. It had only just begun. The car hummed steadily along the fog-covered road, the only sound breaking the silence. The air inside felt thick, suffocating, as if the very atmosphere itself had become heavy with something we couldn't name. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being pursued, that whatever had been watching us, waiting for us to move, was still out there, just beyond our reach. Every turn felt wrong, every stretch of road stretched into an eternity. I glanced in the rearview mirror again, hoping to see something familiar, some landmark to confirm we were still on the right track, but it was just more endless gray. There was no sign of life, no sign of anything real. The trees stood like silent sentinels, their dark silhouettes pressing in from all sides. "We're still going in circles," Sam muttered from the passenger seat, his voice tight. "This doesn't make sense." Mike, in the back seat, was visibly sweating. His hands clenched the armrest, and he kept looking out the window, scanning the fog, the trees. He hadn't said much since we saw the figure in the window of the house. I could tell he was terrified. We all were. We need to stop. This is getting ridiculous, I said, my voice coming out rough, as if the weight of everything pressing in on me was starting to break through. My hands tightened on the wheel, but I was terrified of what would happen if we stopped again. What if the house came back? Or worse, what if something else came after us? But the moment I spoke, something changed. The fog, which had been so thick that it felt almost alive, suddenly parted. Not in a natural way, no wind, no breeze, just like it was pulled back by unseen hands, leaving us in a clear patch of road. At first, I didn't notice. My mind was too clouded by panic, too consumed with the desperate need to get out of this place. But as I looked up, I saw the figure standing by the side of the road. My heart stopped. It was the same figure from the house, the tall, thin shape that had been watching us from the window. This time, it wasn't in the house. It was standing there, just off the road, as if it had been waiting for us. Its head was tilted at an odd angle, its features obscured by the shadows. But there was something about the way it moved or didn't move that made my blood run cold. What the hell is that? Sam's voice was barely a whisper, as though speaking too loudly might provoke it. I slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching as we came to a stop just a few feet from the figure. I was shaking now, my pulse pounding in my ears. For a long moment, we just stared at it, unable to comprehend what we were seeing. And then, the figure moved. It didn't walk, at least, not like a person would. Its limbs twisted unnaturally, as though they were made of something much less human, something that defied the laws of physics. It wasn't walking, it was gliding, hovering just above the ground, its long arms stretching out toward us like some kind of monstrous, spider-like creature. Go! Go! Sam screamed, his voice snapping me back into reality. But I couldn't move. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the thing standing there. It wasn't just the sight of it, it was the feeling it gave off. Like an electric charge in the air, like a weight pressing down on my chest, suffocating me. I could feel the fear vibrating in my bones. Mike, who had been silent until now, suddenly yelled out, "It's coming for us! Move!" That snapped me into action. My hands were shaking as I threw the car into reverse, slamming my foot down on the gas. The engine roared to life, but before we could even begin to pull away, something slammed into the back of the car with a deafening thud. The car lurched forward, but I had no control over it. It was as if something was pushing us from behind, shoving us forward into the fog. I jerked the wheel to the side, trying to get away, but the road was twisting, narrowing. There was nowhere to go but forward, deeper into the fog, deeper into whatever nightmare had us trapped. "Why won't it let us leave?" Sam shouted, his voice filled with panic. The car bucked violently as I tried to maneuver it, but it felt like someone was fighting me, keeping me on this cursed path. And then, out of nowhere, the fog parted again. But this time, what I saw made me freeze. Ahead of us, there was a clearing. A massive, gnarled tree stood at the center, its roots twisted and writhing like serpents. And beneath it, standing still as stone, was a figure. It was the same one we had seen before, the one watching from the house. But now it wasn't just one figure. There were more dozens of them, standing perfectly still, arranged in a wide arc around the tree. Their faces were hidden in shadow, but the presence of so many gathered so silently was more terrifying than anything I had ever seen. I could feel the temperature in the car drop. It wasn't just the cold air from outside. It was like the warmth of life itself was being drained away. "Go! Go!" Mike screamed from the back, his voice full of desperation. I didn't need any more prompting. I slammed the pedal to the floor, but the car was no longer responding. The engine screamed in protest, but it felt like something was holding us back, like something was physically keeping us trapped in place. And then, as if the very ground beneath us had decided to betray us, the car lurched forward, the wheels screeching as we were yanked off the road. I could feel the car tipping, its balance failing, as we careened toward the figure beneath the tree. In that moment, I knew we weren't meant to escape. Not from this place, not from whatever was here. The moment before the car hit the figure beneath the tree was the moment everything stopped. Time, reality, everything. It ceased to exist. All that remained was the overwhelming terror of knowing we had run out of time. Everything went black. The world snapped back into focus with a jolt, a sudden explosion of sound and motion that I couldn't comprehend. The car had come to a stop, but I couldn't tell how we got there, or what had happened in between. My heart was pounding, my chest heaving as I tried to make sense of the chaos around me. The fog had thickened again, swirling in through the broken windows, pressing in on us from every direction. The air was heavy, thick with a chill that went beyond cold. It felt unnatural, like it was made of something that wasn't supposed to exist. I turned to look at Sam and Mike. Sam was breathing hard, his face pale, his hands gripping the seat in front of him. Mike, on the other hand, looked like he'd seen something far worse than the terror that was crawling through my own veins. His eyes were wide, unblinking, as if the sheer weight of what we had just experienced had broken something inside of him. "What the hell happened?" Sam croaked, his voice shaky and strained. I don't know," I stammered. My hands were still trembling as I gripped the steering wheel, but I couldn't bring myself to move. Something was wrong. We should have been gone by now, but we weren't. It felt like we were stuck in that moment, the moment when everything had gone wrong. But it wasn't just that. The air, the way it felt inside the car, was different, as if something had shifted, as if reality itself had become malleable. "I need to get out of here," Mike said, his voice cracking with fear. "We need to leave." The desperation in his voice was too much. I didn't care how afraid I was. I had to get us out. I looked around, trying to figure out where the hell we were. I opened the door, and immediately the fog pressed in, thick and suffocating. It was as if we were surrounded by something alive, something that didn't want us to leave. My feet were heavy on the ground, like I was walking through water, but I pushed forward, motioning for Sam and Mike to follow me. We started walking, the three of us stumbling along, trying to stay together as the fog seemed to close in on us. We passed the tree, but now it was just a twisted silhouette in the distance, no longer the ominous figure it had been before. There were no more figures standing beneath it, no more eyes watching from the darkness. It didn't make sense. How could everything be gone so quickly? Sam's voice broke through the thick fog, pulling me out of my thoughts. "We need to go back to the car. It's not safe out here." But something was telling me not to go back, not to let the car be the place where everything ended. I turned to look at him. What if the car was the problem? What if that's what kept us here? Mike, who had been silent until now, shook his head. "No, we need to leave. We need to get as far away from this place as possible." We kept walking, the mist swirling around us like an entity of its own. The ground beneath our feet seemed uneven, as though we weren't walking on solid earth anymore. Every step felt like it was leading us deeper into something, in a place that didn't belong in the world we knew. I couldn't shake the feeling that the land itself was alive, that something beneath the surface was watching us, waiting for us to make a mistake. "How much farther?" Sam asked, his voice barely above a whisper. He was looking over his shoulder constantly, as if expecting something to appear out of the fog at any moment. "Not far," I said, my own voice trembling as I spoke. "We just need to get to the road. We can figure out what happened when we're away from here." We walked for what felt like hours, the fog closing in tighter with every step. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of everything. Had we been stuck in some kind of loop? Had it all been some sort of hallucination, a trick of the mind, a collective fear that had twisted the very fabric of reality around us? But then, just when I thought we might make it out, the road appeared. A long stretch of asphalt, cracked and broken in places, but it was real. It was something familiar. And it was the first sign that maybe, just maybe, we weren't lost forever. But when we reached it, I stopped. The cars were gone. There were no headlights in the distance. No other vehicles on the road. We were alone, completely and utterly alone. "We're back," Mike said, his voice flat. "No, we're not," I replied, my throat tightening. This isn't right." I turned to look behind me, but the fog was too thick to see the path we had walked. It was as if everything had been erased, like we had never left. And that's when I realized it wasn't over. The trees at the edge of the road were now gone, replaced by a thick, inky blackness that stretched for miles in every direction. No stars. No moon. Nothing. Where are we? Sam asked, his voice trembling. I don't know, I whispered. And then I saw it, a figure standing in the distance. A silhouette against the blackness. It wasn't just any figure. It was the same one we had seen. The one from the window of the house. The one that had been watching us all along. It hadn't left. It was still here, somewhere. Watching. Waiting. I grabbed Mike's arm, my heart pounding in my chest. We needed to run, but where could we go? There was nothing here. Just darkness. And that figure. We turned around, but there was no escape. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had trapped us here was still in control. We hadn't left. We hadn't escaped. It was only the beginning, and there was no way out. The fog was closing in around us again, the chill seeping deeper into my bones. The land, the figures, the roads had all blurred together, spinning into something beyond our understanding. There was no clarity, no escape. Only the creeping terror of knowing that we were trapped, caught in something we could never fully comprehend. All we could do was wait and wonder how long before the fog consumed us entirely. We never spoke again after that night. The fog still lingers in my thoughts, as if it's following me, even though the physical fog is long gone. Every time I close my eyes, I feel it, this suffocating weight, like it's pressing down from all sides, closing in. I've tried to put the events of that night behind me, but no matter how far I drive or how many miles I've put between myself and that place, there's always a part of me that's drawn back, like an invisible tether pulling me toward the unknown. When we finally stumbled back onto the road that night, it felt like we were ghosts. The cars, once our lifeline to the outside world, were nowhere to be seen. The road was empty, the blackness of the night seemingly endless. And that figure we had seen standing in the distance, in the blackness, it was always in the back of my mind, like a shadow lingering just out of reach, always watching. We didn't speak. We couldn't. There were no words to say, no way to explain what had happened. The fear, the confusion, it was all too overwhelming. We had walked into that place, thinking we were just going on a simple road trip. But what we had found was something far darker, something that existed in the spaces between reality and the unknown. It was like the rules had shifted, and we were no longer in control of what happened to us. We managed to get to a town eventually. I don't know how or exactly how much time had passed, but we found ourselves in a small diner, sitting in a booth, barely saying a word. The faces of the other patrons were unfamiliar, the sounds of the diner almost soothing in their normalcy, but there was no comfort. Not for me, not for Sam, and certainly not for Mike. The normal world felt wrong, alien, like we had slipped into a reality that wasn't ours, one that wasn't meant for us to understand. I never asked Sam or Mike what they saw or what they felt during those hours, and neither did they. We had all seen the same thing, felt the same terror, but there was an unspoken agreement to never speak of it again. The tension was so thick in the air between us, it was almost unbearable. We weren't the same people after that night. Not by a long shot. Something had changed in us, something fundamental, and we all knew it. I returned home a few days later, but I never stayed in one place for too long. I felt as though I was constantly being watched, like those eyes from the figure in the fog were still on me, waiting for me to slip up, waiting for me to make a mistake. I would catch myself glancing over my shoulder, as if expecting something to be lurking behind me. The worst part? No one believed us. When I told a friend, when I confided in someone close, I could see the doubt in their eyes. They listened with polite interest, but I could tell they didn't truly understand. How could they? They hadn't been there. They hadn't felt the cold, the fear, the strange, suffocating grip of the place we had ended up in. They hadn't seen the things we saw. And so, they dismissed it as some kind of shared delusion, a trick of the mind, a result of stress or fear. But it wasn't. It was real. It was as real as the car I was driving, as real as the ground beneath my feet. I couldn't get the image of the figure out of my mind, the way it had just stood there, motionless, in the blackness. No movement, no sound, just a presence. It wasn't a man or a woman. It wasn't human. It wasn't even alive in the way we understand it. I didn't want to think about it, but it was always there, just at the edge of my thoughts. haunting me, reminding me of that night. A week passed, and I tried to get back to normal life. I buried myself in work, in anything that would keep me distracted, but it was no use. The memories, the images, they kept resurfacing. And with them came a strange sensation, one I couldn't quite place. It was as though I was being followed. I'd hear footsteps behind me, but when I turned around, no one would be there. The shadows seemed deeper than they should be. The air felt thicker, like something was pressing down on me, making it harder to breathe. I reached out to Sam and Mike, hoping to talk about what had happened, but neither of them ever replied. Their phones went straight to voicemail. I checked social media, but there were no updates, no posts. It was as if they had disappeared off the face of the earth. The thought sent chills down my spine. Had the fog claimed them? Had they been swallowed up by whatever dark force we had encountered that night? And so, I find myself here, writing this, trying to make sense of it all, but I'm not sure I ever will. Maybe we weren't meant to understand. Maybe that's the scariest part of all, knowing that there are things out there beyond our comprehension, things that exist just outside the reach of our understanding, waiting in the shadows, watching. I can't help but wonder if I'm still trapped in that place, if any of us are. Maybe we were never meant to escape. Maybe this is just another layer of the fog, a different dimension where the rules don't apply. A part of me hopes I'll never know. The last time I checked, my GPS was still on. And as much as I wish I could erase it, I can't, because it was the one thing that led me there. And for some reason, I can't bring myself to turn it off. In the silence of the night, I often hear the faint hum of it in the background, just like before, as if it's calling me back. And I know, deep down, that I'll never be free from it.